There are some books that do not merely sit in history. They wait at the edge of canon, at the edge of respectable theology, at the edge of political language, almost like sealed rooms that later generations keep pretending not to notice. And when those rooms are opened, what spills out is rarely simple. Not because the text is magical in the childish sense, and not because every ancient warning is a coded prediction of our own machines. It is something more unsettling than that. Certain old texts do not predict our century. They expose its logic. That is where we begin tonight. Not with the easy claim that the Book of Enoch foresaw satellites, biometric databases, machine learning, predictive policing, or digital blacklists in some literal and mechanical way. It did not. A serious reading has to reject that temptation at once. The Book of Enoch belongs to the ancient world. It emerges from Jewish apocalyptic imagination, from a period of profound pressure, fear, and theological wrestling. It is a layered text, a composite text, a visionary text. It is not scripture for most traditions, though it remained highly influential and survives in full in Ethiopic transmission. If we want to read it honestly, we have to read it as ancient literature first. But ancient does not mean irrelevant, and symbolic does not mean weak. Because sometimes a text from the deep past sees something about power that remains stable even when the tools change. Sometimes a mythic world describes an operation of domination so precisely that the costumes can change, the metals can become code, the giants can become institutions, the heavenly watchers can become sensor grids, and yet the structure still feels recognizable. That is the possibility we are tracing tonight. The Book of Enoch gives us a world in which certain beings descend with knowledge they were never meant to distribute. They do not arrive merely as monsters. They arrive as teachers, instructors, technologists of corruption. They pass on arts that accelerate violence, vanity, domination, occult manipulation, and social distortion. Their knowledge does not remain abstract. It becomes infrastructure in human life. It alters bodies, economies, desires, and relationships. It produces a world in which scale itself becomes corrupted. Too much power, too little restraint, too much appetite, too little reverence, and eventually the result is not enlightenment, but total disorder.
That frame matters more than it first appears.
Because our age also worships instructors of hidden systems. Our watchwords are innovation, optimization, disruption, frictionless integration, predictive intelligence, seamless governance, total connectivity. We are told that more information means more freedom, more visibility means more security, more data means more rational administration, more automation means more efficient human life. But if you slow down and listen beneath the sales language, another possibility begins to whisper. What if some forms of knowledge do not merely liberate? What if they reorganize dependence? What if they build a world in which seeing becomes control, prediction becomes governance, access becomes permission, and human beings are increasingly forced to live inside systems they did not design, cannot inspect, and are told to trust because they are too complex to challenge? That is why Enoch is useful here, and Enoch not as a newspaper from the future, as a grammar of suspicion. It teaches us to ask what kind of knowledge is being distributed, by whom, for what purpose, with what effects on ordinary human life, and what happens when power justifies itself through revelation while corrupting the very conditions of freedom. Tonight, then, we are going to move carefully. We will not flatten Enoch into conspiracy. We will not pretend an ancient apocalypse is a technical manual for modern geopolitics. And we will not make the lazy mistake of assuming that every surveillance system on Earth is one coordinated supernatural plot. Reality is more dangerous than that precisely because it is so ordinary. Institutions do not need horns. They need budgets, databases, vendors, legal carve-outs, cloud storage, border contracts, quietly updated terms of service, machine vision, procurement deals, and a frightened public willing to trade dignity for the promise of security. That is the world we inhabit. And in a strange way, it is a deeply Enochian world. A world full of forbidden arts that no longer call themselves forbidden. A world in which power increasingly descends in invisible layers, from orbital systems overhead, to cable routes undersea, to data centers in remote landscapes, to facial recognition cameras at terminals and streets, to algorithmic engines that buy and sell at inhuman speed, to predictive systems that claim they can infer who we are, what we will do, where we will go, whether we are a risk, whether we are trustworthy, whether we deserve entry, credit, work, mobility, or the presumption of innocence. The ancient text would not recognize the devices, but it would recognize the temptation to turn knowledge into hierarchy, the temptation to treat human beings as raw material for systems of extraction and command, the temptation to collapse mystery into management, the temptation to call corruption progress because it arrives draped in brilliance. And once you begin to read the modern world through that lens, certain parallels become difficult to ignore. The Watchers teach the arts that intensify human self-destruction. Modern systems accelerate finance beyond human moral speed and create automated trading architectures whose decisions are executed in milliseconds, where volatility itself can be amplified by code, and similar algorithms can create systemic risk and flash crash conditions in markets that affect millions who will never see the machine making the move. The Watchers open hidden techniques of manipulation. Modern AI systems are increasingly used not only for convenience, but for targeting, policing, ranking, persuasion, battlefield automation, identity matching, border screening, and behavioral inference, often by institutions far more interested in compliance than in human flourishing. The Watchers bring knowledge that exceeds the ethical maturity of the world receiving it. Modern societies build tools for prediction, automation, surveillance, and coercive analysis long before they agree on meaningful accountability, and in both cases, the damage is not only technical, it is moral. It is spiritual in the broadest sense of the word, because a world in which every movement is tracked, every preference is harvested, every face becomes a credential, every pattern becomes a score, and every deviation becomes suspicious, is not merely a more efficient world. It is a world in which the human person risks being translated into a continuously updated file. That translation is one of the great hidden violences of our century. A person is no longer first encountered as presence. A person becomes a profile, a trajectory, a risk cluster, a biometric signature, a confidence score, a likelihood. And once that shift becomes normal, freedom begins to narrow in ways that do not always look dramatic from the outside. The prison may no longer need walls if the map itself can refuse you. The guard may no longer need to know your name if the system already does. The accusation may no longer arrive in court if it has already been absorbed into a predictive model. The blacklist may no longer be nailed to a public gate if it lives inside interoperable databases, denial codes, risk flags, fraud detection systems, and machine-readable identities shared across agencies and private intermediaries. This is one of the reasons the Book of Enoch still feels charged. Its world is a world in which heavenly rebellion becomes administrative corruption on earth. Knowledge moves downward and reorganizes the conditions of life. Violence becomes scalable. Human beings begin losing proportion. The world is no longer merely sinful. It is systemically distorted. That word matters, systemically, because our own age has become very skilled at talking about technology as though each system were neutral until individually misused. A camera is just a camera. A dataset is just a dataset. A model is just a model. A satellite is just a satellite. A social score is just governance. A biometric checkpoint is just efficiency. A trading algorithm is just optimization. An AI classifier is just a tool. But history teaches a harder lesson. Tools are never just tools once they are embedded in hierarchies that determine who sees, who is seen, who predicts, who is predicted, who judges, who is judged, who is sorted, and who is denied the ability to contest the sorting. That is where Enoch becomes diagnostic. The Book of Enoch asks not only what knowledge is, but what kind of world a certain knowledge produces when it enters human society under conditions of pride, domination, and unequal power. So that is our task tonight. We are going to read the Watchers not as a cheap code for modern elites, but as an ancient image of knowledge severed from moral order. We are going to read the Nephilim not as tabloid monsters, but as a pattern of oversized extraction, systems that feed on the human world from above. We are going to read surveillance not only as technology, but as a spiritual anthropology, an idea of what a human being is when reduced to data. We are going to read predictive systems as rival providences, machine attempts to prearrange the path before a person has walked it. We are going to read biometric borders as the conversion of the body into the passport and the checkpoint into an always-on theological test of legitimacy. We are going to read digital exclusion as a new caste grammar, one that increasingly decides who counts as visible, trustworthy, movable, employable, insurable, and real. And at the end, we are going to ask whether Enoch offers not a map of modern gadgets, but a vocabulary of resistance, a way to think about sovereignty, community, humility, and limits in a world seduced by total knowledge, because that seduction is real, and it is old. The Book of the Watchers tells us that forbidden knowledge did not remain in the sky. It entered history through instruction. According to one influential interpretation of the text, Asael teaches men to make swords, daggers, shields, and breastplates, and also teaches adornment, dyes, and beautification, after which the world was changed and their ways became corrupt. Other watchers teach charms, spells, and the cutting of roots and trees, arts tied to magic and medicine. That detail is easy to sensationalize. It is more useful to slow down. Notice the pattern. Knowledge appears as technique. Technique alters desire. Desire alters social order. Social order alters what human beings become to one another. That is not only an ancient story, it is a modern one. And if we want to understand how the digital age has become an age of surveillance and control, we have to begin exactly where Enoch begins, with the seduction of mastery. We do not build enormous systems because we hate knowledge. We build them because we love the feeling of overcoming uncertainty. We want to know the market before it moves, the crowd before it gathers, the border before the traveler arrives, the suspect before the act, the dissent before it organizes, the disease before symptoms spread, the face before the name is offered, the future before freedom has had time to choose. That desire always sounds practical. Sometimes it is. But when it becomes total, it begins to mutate into something Enoch would understand very well, a fallen theology of knowledge, one that no longer receives limits as wisdom, but treats limits as obstacles to be engineered away. The consequence is not merely new convenience, it is a new architecture of power. And once that architecture is in place, the question is no longer whether we are being watched in some abstract sense. The question becomes what kind of world is produced when watching itself becomes the infrastructure of rule. That is the night road we are taking. And the first figures we meet on it are the architects of forbidden knowledge. The architects of forbidden knowledge. What makes the watchers so disturbing in the Enochic imagination is not simply that they break a rule, it is the manner of the break. They do not arrive first as beasts. They arrive as transmitters, as mediators of advanced arts, as beings who open capacities the human world was not yet meant to hold in that form. And that distinction matters because domination is rarely introduced as domination. It is introduced as enhancement, as access, as advantage, as the end of limitation. The story is older than technology itself. Give a people a powerful technique and tell them it will solve vulnerability. Tell them it will protect cities, accelerate exchange, reduce friction, secure borders, optimize risk, reveal hidden patterns, make them competitive, make them strong, and in many cases the promise is not entirely false. The ancient arts of metallurgy really do increase human power. Medicine really can heal. Writing can preserve. Measurement can coordinate. Networks can connect. Artificial intelligence can detect patterns no unaided human mind could find quickly. Biometrics can verify identity. Satellites can monitor weather, disasters, crop health, and ecological change. To say a system has dangerous implications is not to say it is unreal or entirely evil. That is precisely why the problem is so difficult. The forbidden art is dangerous not because it has no use. It is dangerous because usefulness can become the cover under which scale, speed, and asymmetry escape moral proportion. In the Enochic frame, the issue is never bare knowledge alone. It is knowledge distributed without wisdom, without lawful order, without reverence for limits, and with catastrophic effects on human life. Once the watchers teach violence-enhancing arts and manipulative arts, the world changes, desire changes, power changes. The ratio between the strong and the weak changes. We know that pattern intimately. Consider high-speed algorithmic trading. In its own language, it is simply the automation of decisions around price, volume, timing, and execution. It reduces manual intervention. It increases speed and efficiency. It can lower transaction costs and exploit tiny informational differences faster than human traders can respond. On the surface, this is just finance becoming more advanced. But the same architecture also creates systemic risk, price discovery distortions, liquidity problems, and flash crash conditions when similar systems begin reacting to one another at inhuman speed. That last phrase matters. Inhuman speed, not evil in itself, but morally destabilizing because it moves power beyond the tempo at which ordinary human judgment can intervene. And when a system moves beyond human tempo, two things usually happen. First, accountability thins out. People still sign off on the system, but fewer people can meaningfully see the whole event as it unfolds. Second, consequences spread downward. The gains remain concentrated near those building or deploying the tools. The shocks radiate outward into lives that never consented to the architecture. This is one of the most Enochian features of modern technological power. The teacher of the forbidden art does not absorb the whole cost of the art. The world does. The same pattern appears even more starkly with weaponized artificial intelligence. Here, too, the public language emphasizes precision, efficiency, target discrimination, force multiplication, and decision support. But once AI systems are embedded in military selection, targeting, battlefield autonomy, or weapons platforms that can identify and engage at machine speed, we enter a realm in which delegation itself becomes spiritually significant. A human being is no longer simply using a tool. A human being is increasingly permitting a technical architecture to participate in life and death judgment. That is not a neutral threshold. Enoch would understand this immediately, even if he would not recognize the hardware. The issue is not whether intelligence in the abstract is good. The issue is what happens when power claims the right to operationalize superior knowledge through force, at scale, with weakened moral friction. The Watchers are not just corrupt because they know more. They are corrupt because they change what humans can do to one another before humans have the wisdom to bear the change. That is exactly the problem of our century. We invent first, we moralize later, if we moralize at all. And often the moral debate itself is confined to experts, agencies, and firms whose incentives are already aligned with deployment. Meanwhile, the surrounding public is asked to trust that the people building the system also understand its long-term effects on freedom, labor, inequality, conflict, dignity, and psychological life. That request for trust has become almost liturgical in modern governance. Trust the process. Trust the experts. Trust the platform. Trust the classification. Trust the score. Trust the automation. But the Book of Enoch is, among other things, a document of mistrust toward unauthorized hierarchies of knowledge. It trains the reader to ask what kind of revelation is being offered and what moral ecology it produces. Does it enlarge human responsibility, or does it seduce humans into power they cannot govern? Does it heal proportion, or dissolve it? Does it make the world more humane, or only more administratively brilliant? In the Book of the Watchers, arts of adornment and arts of weaponry are placed side by side. That detail is sometimes treated as strange or incidental, but it is psychologically precise. The system of corruption touches both violence and perception. It changes what bodies can do and how bodies appear. It shapes force and image at once. Modern infrastructures do the same. Algorithmic systems do not only act, they classify. They do not only enforce, they render legible. They do not only produce outcomes, they produce identities capable of being managed. A modern surveillance order is therefore not just a machine for gathering information. It is a machine for manufacturing visibility under unequal conditions. Some people become hyper-visible to power. Others remain opaque behind corporate secrecy, state privilege, classified procurement, proprietary models, and layered subcontracting. The imbalance is profound. The citizen becomes readable. The system becomes unreadable. That asymmetry is not a side effect. It is the architecture. This is why so much of the digital age feels like a strange reversal of sacred order. Knowledge that was supposed to empower the public often empowers remote institutions instead. Platforms that promised connection become tools of dependence. Systems that promised efficiency become gatekeepers to employment, mobility, finance, communication, and documentation. Technologies that promised personalization become engines of behavioral extraction. The old theological question returns in modern form. When superior knowledge descends into the world, who actually becomes more free? Too often, the answer is not the many, it is the administrator. the trader, the security contractor, the platform owner, the border regime, the state that can fuse multiple databases, the consortium that can buy access to data trails ordinary people did not know they were leaving. And by the time the ordinary person begins to suspect what is happening, the infrastructure is already normal. That is one of the great triumphs of modern systems. They arrive before they are understood. This too resembles the Watchers. Forbidden knowledge in Enoch does not merely produce isolated crimes, it changes civilizational conditions, it restructures the world from the inside out. That is why the right comparison in our own century is not between a single fallen angel and a single corporation or nation-state. The right comparison is between the logic of the Watchers and the logic of integrated technical systems that alter how society itself is governed. Take cloud-scale data extraction. Every click, purchase, route, pause, preference, social graph, search pattern, contact list, location point, voice print, face template, or biometric fragment becomes potentially relevant to systems that derive value from pattern recognition. Some of this patterning is sold as convenience, some as fraud prevention, some as national security, some as personalization, some as seamless identity. But regardless of label, the cumulative result is a human environment increasingly designed around capture. To live digitally is to leak, and leaking has become business. This does not mean every engineer is malevolent or every analytic system is apocalyptic. Again, seriousness requires proportion. But proportion also requires that we name what is plainly happening. The modern technical order converts human life into extractable signal and treats deeper visibility into human behavior as an unquestioned good. That assumption is almost never argued from first principles. It is simply embedded into the way systems are built. The Book of Enoch helps us challenge precisely that embedded assumption. It reminds us that not every revelation into hidden structure is healthy. Not every increase in human capacity is redemptive. Not every enlargement of power should be celebrated because it is impressive. And not every teacher of advanced arts is a benefactor. Sometimes the benefactor is a corrupter with better branding. The same lens helps us think about machine learning in social administration. Once institutions learn to use data not merely to record but to infer, a profound transformation occurs. The goal is no longer only to know what happened, it is to pre-structure what can happen. Eligibility systems anticipate risk, security systems anticipate intent, marketing systems anticipate desire, recommender systems anticipate attention, credit models anticipate default, predictive policing anticipates crime. Now you hear the shift from event to preemption, from reality to anticipation, from response to governance through forecast. This is one of the deepest secret connections between Enoch and the digital age. The Watchers embody the corruption of order through premature, dominating knowledge. They represent an authority that reaches below rightful boundaries and reorganizes the human world according to techniques humans were not ready to steward. Modern predictive infrastructures do something analogous in secular form. They promise to reduce uncertainty by making the future administratively legible before it unfolds. But the future is where freedom lives. That is what makes these systems dangerous. Not because prediction is always wrong, because successful prediction creates incentives to narrow the field in which alternative outcomes can appear. A model that forecasts risk encourages institutions to treat the forecast as actionable. Actionable forecasts justify more monitoring. More monitoring generates more data. More data confirms the category. The category hardens. The person enters the system as a possibility and exits as a pattern. At that point, the technology is no longer simply describing social life, it is writing it. That is the heart of the problem. The Watchers do not merely reveal hidden facts. They inscribe new forms of corruption into human existence. Likewise, digital systems do not merely mirror the world, they increasingly script incentives, permissions, exclusions, and rankings inside it. Once that scripting reaches markets, warfare, policing, welfare distribution, migration management, and civic identity, forbidden knowledge has become social infrastructure, and that is exactly where the next Enochian figure enters the scene. Because once knowledge scales into rule, it no longer looks like instruction alone. It starts to look like giant power, which is to say, the age of the Watchers gives way to the age of the Nephilim blueprint of surveillance. In the Book of Enoch, The giants are the monstrous offspring of a corrupted union, but in narrative terms they are more than biology. They are scale gone wrong, excess embodied, appetite without proportion. A social order crushed from above by beings too large to live in right relation to the world beneath them. That is why the image retains such force. Not because we expect literal giants to return, but because every age produces its own oversized systems, institutions so expanded, so vertically integrated, so insulated from ordinary contestation, that they begin to function like giant beings feeding on the lives below. That is the proper comparison. The modern Nephilim are not creatures of height. They are infrastructures of reach. They are architectures that see widely, absorb constantly, decide remotely, and impose consequences on populations too small to meaningfully negotiate with them one by one. Global data harvesting models fit this pattern with almost eerie precision. Surveillance in the 21st century is not primarily a matter of one spy peering through one window. It is an environment, a planetary arrangement in which data from movement, commerce, speech, identity, communication, and transaction flows upward into large systems that can aggregate, correlate, and act. The giant does not need to know you personally. The giant feeds statistically. This is the genius of modern control. It no longer requires intimate tyranny at every point. It requires interoperable systems that can reduce millions of distinct lives to machine-readable traces and then derive administrative power from those traces. People become useful to the system not because they are known in their fullness, but because they are knowable in fragments that can be reassembled into action models. The Book of Enoch describes a world suffering under corrupted magnitude. Our world suffers under magnitude that calls itself networked intelligence, and the result can feel strangely similar. A human being stands beneath forces too large to answer. Rules descend from far above daily life. The scale of extraction exceeds individual comprehension, and what is taken is not only labor or land, but knowledge of the person. That is what makes surveillance giant-like. It feeds on awareness. It feeds on awareness, and because it feeds continuously, it reshapes how the human being experiences ordinary life. The first shift is spatial. Older systems of domination often depended on visible barriers, walls, checkpoints, fences, guards, papers, gatehouses, iron bars. Those still exist, of course, but increasingly the wall is no longer only concrete, it is computational. Movement is filtered through databases, identity verification systems, mobile device location trails, face matching systems, visa data, watch lists, risk scores, and biometric repositories. The border has migrated from the line to the person. This is one of the most profound political transformations of the digital age. The state no longer merely guards entry points. It extends the border inward by making the body itself a credential. The Department of Homeland Security defines biometrics as automated recognition based on biological and behavioral characteristics such as fingerprints, iris patterns, and facial features. Its Office of Biometric Identity Management maintains a system holding more than 320 million unique identities and processes more than 400,000 biometric transactions per day. Those are dry administrative facts, but pause long enough and feel what they imply. A face becomes a token. An iris becomes a key. A body becomes an index in a machine of verification, comparison, sharing, and denial. This is not merely security practice. It is a new theology of access. In ancient societies, the gate determined who could enter the city. In digital societies, the authenticated body determines who can enter the system. And once access is mediated through machine-readable identity, exclusion becomes simultaneously more invisible and more absolute. A traveler is delayed because the system is uncertain. An asylum seeker is overscreened because the category is high risk. A worker is flagged. A resident is mismatched. A face does not resolve. An iris scan fails. A name is too close to another name. A pattern in the data triggers additional scrutiny. The person on the receiving end may experience all this as isolated inconvenience, but the larger pattern reveals a civilization moving from walls to biometric borders. The body itself becomes the checkpoint, and that checkpoint can travel through airports, through visa systems, through police databases, through welfare access, through phones, through commercial verification systems. through private sector identity services that increasingly blur the line between consumer convenience and administrative surveillance. This is what giant power looks like in mature form. It does not merely watch from a distance. It reorganizes the conditions under which daily life is granted legitimacy. The Nephilim in Enochic imagination consume and dominate through disproportion. Modern surveillance consumes and dominates through asymmetrical legibility. The person is made transparent to institutions that remain opaque to the person. That asymmetry only deepens once visual surveillance rises above the ground. Enoch's world is haunted by heavenly beings who see too much and intervene where they should not. We should resist silly one-to-one comparisons, but we should not ignore the resonance. Modern orbital systems have produced a planet increasingly open to persistent observation. Earth observation is not inherently malign. It supports agriculture, climate science, disaster response, resource monitoring, and countless legitimate civilian uses. Yet the same technical movement has obvious surveillance implications, especially once commercial and state capabilities overlap. The European Space Agency notes that satellite constellations are increasingly designed to reduce revisit time, that is, the interval between observations of the same area, with the sector moving toward numerous smaller satellites to provide better coverage and near real-time monitoring. Read that again slowly. Near real-time monitoring, not because ESA is sinister, but because the phrase captures the aspiration of the entire surveillance century. To shorten the interval between event and visibility, to reduce the time in which something can happen unwitnessed, to minimize the gap between occurrence and capture. This is what the all-seeing dream looks like once translated into engineering. Not literal omniscience, of course. Real systems are partial, error-prone, fragmented, expensive, politically contested, and unevenly distributed. But the aspiration matters. A civilization that invests enormous resources into lowering revisit time, linking orbital observation to geolocation systems, integrating remote sensing with terrestrial data, and correlating imagery with other signals, is a civilization increasingly unwilling to tolerate opacity. Opacity is treated as inefficiency. Opacity is treated as risk. Opacity is treated as a problem to be solved. But for human freedom, a certain degree of opacity is essential. We do not flourish only by being seen. We also flourish by not being continuously reduced to observed objects. To live entirely inside the gaze is to live as if one is always potentially evidence. That psychological shift may be one of the deepest forms of control now being normalized. A society watched from above, classified from within, and verified at every threshold gradually stops behaving like a society of moral agents and starts behaving like a field of manageable subjects. And this is exactly where the Nephilim comparison sharpens. The giants are not simply violent. They reorder the whole atmosphere of life. Their presence makes ordinary human proportion impossible. In the same way, modern surveillance does not only target isolated suspects, it changes the felt scale of existence. The citizen senses that visibility can be activated at any moment. The migrant senses that documentation is never enough. The protester senses that attendance produces a trace. The online user senses that every convenience is also a transaction of exposure. The poor person senses that every request for aid may also become another point of administrative inspection. People begin to self-adjust. That is how giant systems win, not only by force, by atmosphere. And the atmosphere intensifies when surveillance merges with identity infrastructures that promise to distinguish the trustworthy from the suspect. This is where the all-seeing aspect of the Enochic imagination becomes politically relevant. The all-seeing authority in myth is terrifying not simply because it sees, but because its seeing is tied to judgment. It notices in order to classify. It classifies in order to govern. That is exactly how many modern systems operate. A face is seen in order to verify. A movement trail is seen in order to infer. A transaction history is seen in order to score. A communication pattern is seen in order to rank threat. A social graph is seen in order to anticipate behavior. Seeing is never neutral once attached to consequence. And consequence is where we leave the giant field of surveillance and enter the next chamber. Predictive judgment, predictive algorithms, and the loss of free will. There is an old theological horror hidden inside predictive systems. It is the horror of being known in advance by a power that does not love you, not known in the intimate, liberating sense of being understood, known in the administrative sense of being pre-categorized. This distinction is everything. The Book of Enoch is obsessed with corruption of paths, with wrong instruction, wrong alignments, wrong transmissions, wrong rulers, wrong outcomes unfolding from corrupted origins. Modern predictive systems seem almost designed to inherit that structure. They tell institutions not simply what has happened, but what is likely to happen. They identify hotspots, threat scores, risk clusters, fraud probabilities, behavioral anomalies, trust metrics, engagement trajectories, creditworthiness, default likelihood, potential dangerousness. None of these categories is always false. That is what gives them force. But every category that predicts also pressures the future it claims merely to observe. Predictive policing is the clearest example. The Brennan Center describes it as the use of algorithms to analyze large amounts of information in order to predict and prevent future crime. Place-based systems identify locations and times judged high risk, while person-based systems attempt to identify individuals or groups likely to commit or be victimized by crime. Critics warn that such systems often lack transparency, threaten civil liberties, and can reinforce racial bias because they rely on historical police data already shaped by discriminatory practices. Notice the spiritual danger hidden in that technical description. The system takes the past, especially a past already overproduced by selective policing, and offers it back as probable future. The probable future justifies concentrated attention. Concentrated attention produces more observed incidents. Those incidents confirm the original model. The corrupted path becomes self-reinforcing. That is an Enochian nightmare in secular form. The fallen power does not merely tempt people into error. It builds an order in which error is recursively fed back into rule. This is why the conversation about free will in the age of predictive systems cannot be reduced to philosophical abstraction. We are not only asking whether human beings metaphysically possess freedom, we are asking whether institutions increasingly behave as though freedom is administratively irrelevant. If a model predicts where disorder is likely, the area gets more attention. If a person is risk-scored, the institution acts before actual conduct has fully unfolded. If a neighborhood is tagged, its residents enter a heightened field of scrutiny, not because every individual has chosen anything wrong, but because the system treats them as statistically proximate to anticipated deviance. At that point, freedom may remain theoretically intact while socially narrowed. That is how modern control works. It does not have to abolish free will to make free action costlier. The psychological effects are profound. A population that knows it is continuously monitored by systems designed to categorize and judge behavior begins to internalize the categories. People self-censor. They avoid certain searches, certain associations, certain forms of protest, certain crossings, certain experiments in identity or thought. They become cautious not only before law, but before pattern recognition. This is a very different kind of obedience than the obedience produced by overt terror. It is quieter, more ambient, more efficient, and in some ways more complete, because the subject begins helping the system produce the desired future. That is why predictive control is not only political, it is spiritual. It acts on imagination. It teaches people that divergence is dangerous, opacity is suspicious, unpredictability is punishable, and conformity is the path of least resistance. The old Enochian image of corrupted paths becomes newly legible here. A path is corrupted not only when a person chooses evil, but when the environment itself is structured to make compliant, machine-readable conduct feel like the only survivable route. That is where social credit logic enters the picture. Again, the point is not sensationalism. The term social credit is often used sloppily in public discourse. Real systems are fragmented, evolving, and often more administratively uneven than lurid Western headlines imply. Still, the underlying principle is clear enough to matter. A Princeton-based analysis describes China's social credit project as a data-powered framework intended to monitor, assess, and shape behavior using incentives, public blacklists and red lists, joint punishment and reward, and online disclosure of rewarded or punished individuals. Read that with Enoch in mind. Monitor, assess, shape, reward trust-keeping, punish trust-breaking, publicly disclose, jointly penalize. This is not just governance, it is moral theater, rendered computational, and its deepest danger is not that it punishes obvious crime. Every society punishes some obvious crime. Its deeper danger is that it can push populations toward behavioral conformity by distributing consequence across domains of life far beyond the original act. Movement, credit, reputation, licenses, opportunities, convenience and legitimacy all become entangled. The person is guided not only by conscience or law, but by a totalizing incentive field. That field is profoundly anti-Enochian in the best sense, because the Book of Enoch, for all its severity, is full of warnings against powers that distort earthly life through corrupt mediation. It is suspicious of authorities that overreach, that contaminate, that teach domination under the sign of secret knowledge. A social credit-like order is the opposite of freedom before God. It is a world in which behavior is increasingly steered by machine-administered visibility, and once a population begins living inside that visibility, the experience of self changes. You are no longer simply acting. You are performing legibility. You are no longer simply acting. You are performing legibility. And once a society reaches that point, free will does not disappear in one dramatic stroke. It is eroded through incentives, through rankings, through anticipatory suspicion, through small punishments that train the nervous system to stay within acceptable rails. This is why algorithmic surveillance can be more spiritually corrosive than many older forms of domination. A prison at least admits it is confining you. A social scoring system can present itself as public trust. A predictive model can present itself as neutral foresight. A behavior-shaping platform can present itself as user convenience. The subject is governed by systems whose control function is blurred by interface design. That blur is itself a weapon. It allows control to masquerade as choice, and it allows people to cooperate with the machinery of their own narrowing because the alternatives feel inconvenient, suspicious, inefficient, or socially costly. Enoch's warning about corrupted paths therefore becomes almost prophetic in moral structure, even if not in literal technological forecast. The point is not that Enoch names a social credit app. The point is that he understands how corrupt powers reorganize the pathways by which human beings move through the world. They do not only tempt isolated acts, they deform the road. That is what so many modern systems now do. They make the safe path the compliant path, the compliant path the visible path, the visible path the scored path, and the scored path the only path on which rights, reputation, and access can move easily, targeting the marginalized through digital exclusion. One of the oldest lies told by large systems is that they apply equally. In practice, they almost never do. Their burdens gather where resistance is weakest, documentation is thinnest, advocacy is scarcest, and social prestige is lowest. That was true in the ancient world. It was true in imperial worlds. It was true under industrial bureaucracy, and it is true now in the age of digital surveillance. This is why the Enochic comparison must finally move below the level of abstraction. The question is not simply whether surveillance exists. The question is who is most likely to be shaped, flagged, blocked, misidentified, blacklisted, over-policed, over-verified, underprotected, and rendered contestable by it. The answer, again and again, is the vulnerable, the poor, the displaced, the undocumented, the over-policed, the religious minority, the racialized outsider, the person whose identity already arrives in public space under suspicion. In the Enochic drama, the corruption introduced by the Watchers and magnified through the giants does not fall evenly across humanity. It creates a world in which excess power devours ordinary life. That devouring is the key. It is not a universal abstraction. It is lived most painfully by those nearest the point where giant systems extract value and impose discipline. Our digital order behaves similarly. Consider facial recognition and police surveillance. Brookings notes that facial recognition and other surveillance technologies can enable more precise discrimination, especially when used by law enforcement agencies already making predictive decisions that disproportionately affect marginalized populations. The same analysis notes that U.S. developed facial recognition systems were found significantly more likely to return false positives or negatives for Black, Asian, and Native American individuals than for white individuals, while communities of color are often overrepresented in law enforcement databases. Sit with that for a moment. The future arrives claiming objectivity, and yet it sees some faces less accurately than others. Not because the people being scanned are less real, because the system was not built from a neutral world. That is exactly how digital exclusion becomes a new caste grammar. The poor and marginalized are not merely harmed by surveillance in the same way as everyone else. They are often positioned as the testing ground on which more aggressive uses become normalized. Predictive policing concentrates on neighborhoods already heavily watched. Benefit fraud systems scrutinize populations dependent on aid. Border biometrics intensify around migrants, asylum seekers, and non-citizens. Platform trust and safety systems often misread dialect, context, activism, or precarious labor. Financial verification systems punish those with incomplete records, unstable addresses, or irregular work histories. Identity proofing assumes access to documents, devices, and continuity that many people do not possess. In each case, the same pattern repeats. The system calls itself universal. But universality is purchased through hidden assumptions about the ideal user. The ideal user is documented, connected, banked, stationary, literate in institutional procedure, easily classified, possessed of a face, accent, history, and address that the model expects. Else becomes friction, and in modern bureaucratic systems, friction can quickly become exclusion. This is where the phrase digital outcast stops sounding dramatic and starts sounding precise. An AI-driven black box does not need to explicitly condemn a person as impure or dangerous. It only needs to deny, delay, or downgrade that person in enough linked systems. A loan application fails because a model flags risk. A housing search fails because tenant screening systems inherit dubious data. A welfare system freezes benefits pending automated review. A border crossing triggers secondary inspection because travel patterns appear anomalous. A content moderation system suppresses speech because context is misread. A workplace screening system filters an applicant out before any human encounter occurs. At no point may there be a visible accuser, only the system, only the result, only the sealed judgment of a process that the affected person cannot fully inspect. This is one of the defining spiritual humiliations of digital life, to be judged by an intelligence that does not explain itself, to be denied by a mechanism with no face, to suspect that one's life has been translated into a pattern and found wanting, but not to know by what chain of inference. The ancient world called some such powers demonic not because everything unseen was magical, but because unseen forces shaping ordinary life produced terror. Modern systems have secularized that experience. The black box is not a demon, but for the person denied by it, especially the poor person with no legal team, no public platform, and no spare time for appeals, it can function with a similar opacity. It pronounces, it withholds, it disciplines, it refuses to clarify. That is why digital exclusion must be understood as more than inconvenience. It is a moral sorting mechanism. It creates zones of semi-personhood, where some individuals remain permanently prove-yourself subjects before institutions that take the legitimacy of the privileged for granted. Think of what that does over time. It teaches the vulnerable to expect suspicion. It teaches the documented to mistake ease for innocence. It teaches the administrators that denial can be depersonalized. It teaches society that pain occurring through systems is less visible than pain occurring through clubs and cages. And because the pain is less visible, it is easier to justify in the name of scale. This is why the poor and displaced sit so near the center of this story. They are often forced to expose more of themselves to receive less. They must provide documents, histories, scans, interviews, biometrics, proof of hardship, geolocated presence, account linkages, and repeated verification merely to access goods wealthier people obtain with far less self-disclosure. The asymmetry is staggering. The vulnerable are made more legible precisely because they have less power to refuse legibility. That is what spiritual gatekeeping looks like in digital form. Not a priest barring the sanctuary, a system quietly deciding whose identity resolves cleanly enough to count, whose data trails are coherent enough to trust, whose behavior scores are stable enough to ensure, whose location patterns are suspicious enough to scrutinize, whose communication habits trigger enhanced review, whose poverty itself is treated as a predictive indicator requiring additional oversight. And the gatekeeper never has to raise its voice. It can simply time out, or request more documents, or assign a risk score, or refuse to explain. This is where the analogy to the victims of the giants becomes most morally serious. The giants in Enoch devour because they are too large to care about proportional human life. Modern systems do not devour flesh in that literal sense. They devour time, recourse, privacy, possibility, dignity, and access. They especially devour these from people least able to survive administrative delay. A missed payment caused by an algorithmic hold can mean eviction. A false match can mean detention. A denied service can mean untreated illness. A wrongly flagged account can mean hunger. A suspended digital identity can mean practical non-existence. Not need. The cruelty of giant systems lies partly in this. They can do great harm through very small outputs. Denied, flagged, pending review, unable to verify, restricted, under investigation, not eligible, no entry. The words are bureaucratically modest. The consequences are not. And because such systems often arrive wrapped in anti-fraud, public safety, or modernization rhetoric, many citizens do not recognize the scale of the violence until they themselves or someone near them falls through the seam. By then, the infrastructure is hard to contest. Procurement contracts are signed, databases are linked, vendors claim trade secrecy, agencies invoke national security, appeals routes are obscure. The human being meets the giant too late. The Book of Enoch understands that pattern with unnerving clarity. Corruption begins above, but suffering concentrates below. The beings with disproportionate reach alter the world. Ordinary creatures absorb the damage. That is precisely how digital exclusion works in our time. The modelers, agencies, and contractors rarely endure the full penalties their systems impose. The single mother, the asylum seeker, the gig worker, the debtor, the prisoner's family member, the undocumented laborer, the racially profiled teenager, the disabled claimant, the stateless traveler, these are the ones asked to live inside the judgment. That is why any serious resistance must begin with them. Not with abstract liberty alone, but with the concrete question, who is being made into the easiest target of machine-mediated suspicion? Once we ask that question honestly, the promise of neutral infrastructure begins to crack. Because neutrality that repeatedly wounds the same populations is not neutral. It is hierarchy at machine speed. And that hierarchy brings us to the deepest chamber of the whole argument. If the systems are this pervasive, if their visibility is this totalizing, if their exclusions are this intimate, then what would resistance even look like? To answer that, we have to return to Enoch one last time, not to the corruption, but to the witness. Decoding the Enochian resistance. The Book of Enoch is not merely a book of monsters and forbidden instruction, it is also a book of exposure. A book that insists corrupted power can be named. A book that refuses to let giant systems pass as ordinary reality. That may be the first lesson for any age of surveillance. Control depends on normalization. Resistance begins in description. The moment a society learns to name a system honestly, to call extraction extraction, to call behavioral shaping, to call biometric overreach, to call predictive control a rival form of providence, the spell weakens slightly, not completely, but slightly. A people able to describe what is being done to them is already less governable than a people taught to call all domination innovation. That is why spiritual sovereignty begins with language. You cannot resist what you are still praising under the wrong name. The second lesson is limit. One of the defining sins in Enoch is transgression of boundaries that were not ours to cross. The modern world is deeply uncomfortable with that language because it hears limits and imagines primitivism, censorship, or fear of progress. But not all limits are enemies. Some are the very conditions of human dignity. A society that cannot say no to comprehensive visibility will eventually lose the difference between care and control. A society that cannot say no to total prediction will eventually turn uncertainty itself into a civic offense. A society that cannot say no to integrating every identifier, every payment stream, every movement record, every biometric marker, every risk score, and every social interaction into unified control architectures will eventually discover that convenience has eaten freedom from the inside. So digital resistance begins with the recovery of principled non-totality. Not every system should be integrated. Not every identity function should be centralized. Not every database should be linked. Not every transaction should be visible. Not every anomaly should trigger inquiry. Not every public problem should be solved through more invasive analytics. And not every uncertainty should be treated as intolerable. That is a deeply countercultural claim now. We live inside civilizations that have trained themselves to equate total information with better governance. But Enoch teaches a harder lesson. More access to hidden structure does not necessarily heal the world. In the wrong hands and under the wrong incentives, it distorts it. The third lesson is witness communities. The isolated person is easy to score, easy to flag, easy to exhaust, easy to persuade that denial was probably deserved. But communities can remember what systems try to erase. They can compare patterns across individual cases. They can notice that the same neighborhoods are overwatched, the same accents are mistrusted, the same paperwork barriers recur, the same appeals disappear into silence, the same categories of people get asked for more proof. In that sense, community is not only emotional support, it is epistemic defense. It protects against the atomization on which giant systems depend. This is why local, community-led forms of digital and material resilience matter so much. When people speak of off-grid movements, the phrase is often romanticized. We should resist simplistic fantasies. No serious person imagines that a modern society can entirely abandon digital systems at scale and return intact to some pure analog innocence. The point is not fantasy withdrawal. The point is partial sovereignty. To build spaces where human life is not entirely captive to centralized technical mediation that can mean different things in different contexts. Community-owned networks, local food systems that reduce total dependence on algorithmically managed supply chains, physical copies of essential records rather than sole reliance on remote verification, cash resilience in worlds drifting toward fully trackable payment ecosystems, mutual aid structures that do not disappear when an account is flagged, open source and privacy-preserving tools where possible, legal advocacy groups able to contest black box determinations, collective literacy around data rights, surveillance technologies, and bureaucratic procedure, places where people can meet without every meaningful association being platform-mediated, scored, optimized, monetized, or archived. None of this is glamorous. That is exactly why it matters. Real resistance is often infrastructural long before it becomes cinematic. The fourth lesson is discernment about convenience. This may be the hardest lesson for affluent societies to learn. Control systems almost never enter through naked coercion alone. They enter through speed, ease, seamlessness, personalization, and relief from friction. Show me a population exhausted enough, and I will show you a population tempted to treat every reduction in friction as good. Yet friction is not always the enemy. Sometimes friction is where moral choice lives. The extra step that keeps one database from talking to another may protect liberty. The annoying delay that requires a human review may preserve recourse. The cash transaction that leaves no commercial behavioral trail may protect dignity. The in-person conversation that refuses total automation may preserve context. Convenience has become a theology because it promises salvation from burden, but some burdens are actually protections. A society that forgets this will soon trade away its remaining opacity for comfort, and then it will wonder why the giant keeps growing. The fifth lesson is spiritual non-compliance. That phrase requires explanation. By spiritual non-compliance, I do not mean theatrical rebellion for its own sake. I mean the disciplined refusal to let machine legibility become the definition of personhood. A human being is more than a profile, more than a wristband, more than a faceprint, more than a location history, more than a credit behavior, more than a probabilistic model of future actions. To say this publicly is not sentimental, it is political and theological at once. Systems of total surveillance depend on reducing the human to what can be captured and acted upon. Resistance therefore requires practices that constantly reassert dimensions of personhood not reducible to capture. Silence, vengeance, prayer, embodied gathering, unscored care, unmonetized friendship. Sabbath from interface, metanoia. Education not driven solely by platform metrics, Metronome, art not optimized for engagement dashboards. Metronome, attention that is given rather than harvested. These things sound soft to technical ears. They are not soft. They are counterformational. They train a human being to live beyond the total claim of systems that want every pulse of life translated into extractable signal. The sixth lesson is protecting the vulnerable first. This is where so many liberty discourses fail. They remain abstract, elite, and individualized. But an Enochian politics of resistance would begin where giant systems most viciously press down. If facial recognition systems misidentify communities of color more often, those communities deserve first-order protection. If predictive policing intensifies surveillance on already over-policed neighborhoods, reform must center those neighborhoods. If biometric systems most burden refugees, migrants, and the undocumented, then any human rights framework worth the name must treat their dignity not as a side issue, but as the measure of whether the system is just at all. If AI-driven benefit screening harms the poor, then anti-surveillance politics that ignore poverty are not merely incomplete, they are morally unserious. This returns us to one of the deepest truths in Enoch. Corrupted powers can be judged by whom they devour. Likewise, modern systems can be judged by whose humanity they find easiest to thin out administratively. The seventh lesson is theological humility before knowledge. This may sound abstract, but it is urgently concrete. A civilization drunk on total data has forgotten that some things should remain proportionate to human scale. Not every human issue is improved by more capture. Not every social problem becomes more humane when it is translated into dashboard management. Not every uncertainty is a design flaw. Democratic societies in particular must relearn the value of restraint, not because information is evil, but because institutions with superior information and weak accountability will almost always be tempted to exceed their rightful bounds. Humility is what tells a society that just because it can build a system does not mean it should normalize the system. Humility is what interrupts the slide from emergency tool to permanent architecture. Humility is what says a camera built for one use should not automatically become the camera for every use. Humility is what says a biometric collected for one threshold should not silently become the credential for all thresholds. Humility is what says that citizens are not raw material for behavioral experimentation by public or private actors. Humility is what says the future must remain at least partly unwritten by machine governance. Without that humility, resistance becomes almost impossible because the moral vocabulary itself erodes. People stop asking whether a system is fit for a free society and begin asking only whether it can be implemented efficiently. That is civilizational exhaustion. And exhausted civilizations are easy prey for giant infrastructures. There is another dimension of Enochian resistance worth naming: archives of memory. The Book of Enoch survives as a witness text from the margins of canon. That fact alone should alert us to the political importance of preserving records outside dominant approval systems. In a fully digitized order, memory itself can become centralized, search-ranked, throttled, deplatformed, or buried beneath volume. Community archives, independent media, local records, whistleblower documentation, legal findings, church testimonies, oral histories, and redundant storage all become forms of resistance against the monopolization of truth. If the system controls what is remembered, it will eventually control what counts as abuse. If it controls what counts as abuse, it will control what counts as normal. And if it controls what counts as normal, giant power will wear the face of necessity forever. So yes, resistance may require encryption and policy reform and procurement battles and litigation and standards work and technical design interventions. All of that matters. But there is also a deeper contest underway. The contest over whether human beings still believe they are more than the categories into which infrastructures sort them. That is the spiritual front, and it may be the decisive one. Because once a people accepts total categorization as the price of social belonging, formal freedom becomes a shell. People may still vote, still shop, still travel sometimes, still speak carefully, still click "I agree." Yet their world has already been narrowed by invisible governors. Enoch's great value is that it shocks us out of treating such narrowing as ordinary. It makes hidden domination feel strange again, and that strangeness is essential. Without it, we become too well adapted to our own diminishment. The false gospel of total visibility, Every age has its gospel. Not always a religious gospel in the narrow sense, but a promise of salvation around which public trust organizes itself. The gospel of our age, in many powerful institutions, is visibility. If only enough can be seen, tracked, correlated, and predicted, then crime can be prevented, fraud reduced, borders secured, markets stabilized, violence deterred, disease mapped, dissent assessed, and behavior guided into safer channels. This is not wholly false. That is why it persuades. Visibility really does reveal certain harms. It can document abuse, it can expose corruption, it can coordinate relief, it can support science, it can preserve evidence against lies. But a gospel becomes false, not only when it contains no truth. A gospel becomes false when it takes one truth and inflates it into total moral authority. That is what has happened with visibility. We have begun to act as though what cannot be captured is either suspicious or negligible, as though the unseen dimension of human life, privacy, interiority, ambiguity, experimentation, repentance, unrecorded solidarity, unmonetized thought, unprofiled relation, has no positive civic value, as though freedom is merely the right to move around inside a well-administered observation field. That is not freedom. That is domestication, and it produces a culture increasingly unable to distinguish transparency from exposure. True transparency is often demanded of power. Exposure is often demanded of the weak. Surveillance states and surveillance markets confuse the two deliberately. They promise transparency while arranging exposure. They leave high institutions thick with secrecy while requiring ordinary people to become ever more legible. The public is told to surrender data for the public good. The vendor keeps the model proprietary. The agency cites security exemptions. The platform reserves the right to change terms. The citizen gets the frictionless interface and the permanent trail. This is why the false gospel of total visibility is so spiritually corrosive. It trains populations to accept asymmetry as rational. It tells them that being seen is the same as being safe, that being categorized is the same as being known, that being measured is the same as being served. But measured persons can still be abandoned. Categorized persons can still be wronged. Visible persons can still be erased from moral concern. Mundig still snail. Sometimes visibility even makes erasure easier. Once a group is already hyper-visible to systems of suspicion, its suffering can be administratively managed rather than answered. And because the management generates data, the managers can point to dashboards and insist the issue is under control. Numbers become incense for the new temple. But incense is not mercy, and dashboards are not justice. This is where Enoch's warning against corrupt heavenly administration regains all its force. The problem is not merely that bad beings do bad things. The problem is that they turn corruption into cosmic order. They make domination feel embedded, fated, above challenge. They widen the gap between ordinary creatures and the structures ruling them. Modern surveillance systems perform a secular version of the same maneuver when they naturalize the idea that governance requires ever deeper extraction from the governed. The result is a culture that mistakes total intelligibility for civilization. That mistake is deadly, because human beings are not most human when they are most machine-readable. They are most human when they can act, gather, mourn, dissent, worship, love, fail, repair, wonder, and become without every threshold being mediated by hidden risk engines. That is the world total visibility quietly endangers. Machine providence and the war on uncertainty. At the deepest level, surveillance capitalism, surveillance states, and predictive governance all share one ambition. They want to conquer uncertainty. Not all uncertainty, of course. Markets still need speculation. Politics still needs theater. War planners still call much of the future fog. But when it comes to populations, institutions increasingly dream of a world in which uncertainty can be managed down to acceptable thresholds. That dream sounds technical. In reality, it is theological. Why theological? Because it concerns providence. Who gets to anticipate the path? Who gets to define risk before action? Who gets to say which futures should be opened and which should be closed? Traditional theological languages located such total knowledge outside ordinary human administration. Enoch is one of many ancient texts wrestling with the dangers that arise when beings intermediate between heaven and earth in corrupted ways. The issue is not merely information. It is sovereignty over the moral shape of the world. Modern predictive systems are not gods, but they function as rival providences. They distribute anticipatory judgment across social life. They sort possibilities in advance. They place probability where humility should often remain. They whisper to institutions, this neighborhood first, this traveler second, this borrower never, this claimant suspicious, this worker unstable, this classroom high risk, this gathering anomalous, this speech pattern dangerous, this body in need of further verification. And because these whispers are mathematical, they acquire an authority that older prejudices could only envy. Bias now arrives with dashboards. Class prejudice arrives with optimization rhetoric. Administrative suspicion arrives with machine confidence scores. That is what makes the present moment so perilous. The old human desire to dominate uncertainty has learned to speak in the language of data, and once it does, resistance becomes harder because citizens are told that objection itself is irrational. Why oppose a system that simply reflects the evidence? Why fear a model that merely finds patterns? Why object to automated triage if the process is more scalable than human review? Why resist integrated surveillance if it reduces fraud, catches suspects, accelerates clearance, or protects the public? These are not foolish questions. They are the right questions asked inside the wrong frame. The wrong frame assumes that the only meaningful values at stake are efficiency, accuracy, coverage, and deterrence. The frame excludes older human goods that cannot be captured so easily: dignity, opacity, mercy, forgiveness, contestability, second chances, unprofiled existence, equal moral presumption, the right not to become permanent data residue, the right to be encountered before one is prejudged. The digital order repeatedly sacrifices these goods because it does not know how to price them. And what cannot be priced is often treated as negligible. This is one reason Enoch remains a useful companion text. It restores catastrophe to systems that would prefer to appear merely technical. It reminds us that corruption can hide inside brilliance. It reminds us that excess knowledge without proportion is not enlightenment but ruin. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that there is a difference between wisdom and control. Wisdom accepts creaturely scale. Control revolts against it. Wisdom leaves room for judgment, mercy, and surprise. Control wants the future pre-processed. Wisdom knows that some opacity protects human becoming. Control experiences opacity as a threat. Wisdom recognizes that persons exceed categories. Control treats excess as inefficiency. Under machine providence, the human being becomes a problem of legibility. Institutions increasingly want each person to arrive already translatable into interoperable signals. Identity should resolve, risk should quantify, intent should infer, eligibility should compute, fraud should detect, sentiment should track, deviance should model, exposure should monetize. Nothing should remain too thick, too ambiguous, too local, too embodied, too relational, or too unstructured for the system to digest. This is why so much modern life feels thinner than its technology is advanced. The systems become richer, the person becomes flatter, and once the person is flattened, governance itself changes tone. Public administration begins to resemble intake processing. Democratic accountability yields ground to procurement expertise. Human discretion remains, but often only at the margins, and usually after the model has already framed the possible responses. The official becomes less a judge than a steward of a technical pipeline. Citizens become less neighbors in a shared polity than entries crossing decision thresholds. A society can still call this freedom, but the word begins to hollow. Because freedom without opacity is only managed permission. Freedom without contestability is only soft coercion. Freedom without the ability to appear before another human being prior to model judgment is only administrative theater. Again and again the system tells us it is only trying to know enough to keep order, but the desire to know enough is never stable. It expands. Once a city links cameras, it wants analytics. Once it has analytics, it wants correlation. Once it has correlation, it wants prediction. Once it has prediction, it wants preemption. Once it has preemption, it wants integration with other domains. School data, health data, travel data, financial signals, social media traces, device identifiers, access logs, location history, pattern of life analysis. This is how giants grow. Not overnight, by accretion, by legitimate sub-purposes becoming interoperable ambition, by every solved problem becoming the precedent for deeper reach. The public rarely experiences this as a dramatic coup. It experiences it as upgrades, new features, better coordination, less fraud, more secure identity, safer cities, faster checkpoints, smarter governance, more targeted benefits, more proactive intervention. And because each upgrade carries a narrow rationale, people fail to see the cumulative architecture. But cumulative architecture is exactly what Enoch asks us to perceive. Corruption there is not reducible to one bad choice. It becomes a world where teachings, powers, bodies, appetites, and authorities all stop being proportionate to one another. A world in which human beings can no longer inhabit life without constantly feeling the distortions introduced from above. That describes surveillance modernity with unnerving precision. The distortion from above is no longer just royal decree or visible coercion. It is persistent interoperability. It is the quiet assumption that the solution to disorder is more extraction. It is the fusion of private incentive and public authority around deeper access to human patterns. It is the way machine systems can spread without ever presenting themselves honestly as a new political constitution. Perhaps that is why so many people feel watched, even when they cannot name exactly how. The sensation is not paranoia in every case. It is often the body's dim recognition that ordinary life is being reformatted around anticipatory visibility, the phone in the pocket, the camera at the entrance, the identity verification request, the unusual payment hold, the flagged login, the location prompt, the recommendation engine that somehow knows too much, the workplace dashboard, the school monitoring software, the border kiosk, the landlord screening tool, the city sensor grid. Each one alone may be explainable. Together they create a civilization with an altered metaphysics. In that civilization, to exist is increasingly to emit. To emit is to be processed. To be processed is to become governable. And governability is taken as proof of good order. But Enoch would ask a more dangerous question. Governable by whom, according to what moral vision, and with what effect on the ordinary creature's relation to freedom? That question breaks the spell, because the answers are rarely neutral. Some entities want data because they sell derivatives of prediction, some because they optimize ad markets, some because they seek strategic advantage, some because they fear terrorism, some because they fear disorder, some because bureaucracies always hunger for simplification, some because digital identity is profitable, some because the distinction between citizen, consumer, suspect, and user has become increasingly porous. The result is not one conspiracy, but one environment. And environments shape souls, off-grid as moral imagination. This is why the outlines call for community-led off-grid movements deserve serious treatment, not as fantasy prepper theater, as moral imagination. To go partially off-grid is not only to unplug a device or move to the woods. At its best, it is to cultivate zones of life that are less dependent on extractive visibility, to recover forms of local competency, memory, reciprocity, and embodiment that giant systems cannot easily swallow, to shorten the distance between need and response, to rebuild trust through persons rather than through scoring infrastructure, to keep some part of human life from being entirely rerouted through centralized pipes. This can take humble forms: a neighborhood that knows how to care for its elderly without requiring every interaction to pass through optimization platforms, a church or civic association that maintains mutual aid and emergency records outside fragile account systems, a local cooperative that understands the value of cash and direct exchange when digital payment ecosystems fail or become coercive, a school that teaches children not only how to use devices, but how devices use them, a family that practices Sabbath from screens, not as nostalgia, but as sovereignty over attention, a migrant rights group that educates newcomers about biometric collection, document retention, and legal recourse, a labor network that preserves worker solidarity outside employer surveillance tools, an artist collective that makes beauty unoptimized for engagement metrics, a food network that reduces dependence on tracked, ranked, platform-mediated access. These are not absolute exits from system power. Such exits are rare, but partial exits matter because they keep imagination from collapsing into inevitability. The most dangerous sentence in any surveillance age is this: There is no alternative. The Book of Enoch itself survived, partly because some communities carried texts the dominant center did not finally authorize. That survival is a reminder that marginal memory can outlast official consensus. Likewise, local and community resistance today may appear small beside orbital surveillance, transnational data brokerage, and state corporate analytics. Yet smallness is not irrelevance. Smallness is often where alternative moral orders remain possible. The off-grid impulse, properly understood, is therefore not anti-technology in the childish sense. It is anti-totalization. It insists that not every domain of life should be folded into unified visibility. It asks what kinds of technical mediation honor persons and what kinds convert them into administrable surfaces. It asks where decentralization protects dignity. It asks how redundancy can serve liberty. It asks whether communities can preserve friction as a moral good, rather than eliminate it as waste. These are mature questions, and they are urgently needed because centralization now wears humanitarian masks. The unified identity system helps the poor. The digital wallet helps inclusion. The smart city helps efficiency. The integrated health record helps outcomes. The predictive welfare model helps target resources. The AI security layer helps keep children safe. The border biometrics help legitimate travel. Each claim may contain some truth. The danger lies in the cumulative conversion of every social good into a reason for deeper data dependence. Once dependence deepens enough, opting out becomes social self-harm. That is when the grid stops being infrastructure and becomes destiny. Off-grid imagination exists to interrupt that transition. It reminds us that a civilization which cannot imagine partial non-compliance has already accepted more domination than it realizes. This is not a call to chaos. It is a call to plural sovereignty, to many sites of human life not wholly reducible to one operating system of visibility, to structures of belonging not fully collapsible into state or platform recognitions, to communities capable of feeding, remembering, teaching, and protecting one another without first asking a risk engine for permission. That may sound modest. It is revolutionary enough. The reason it sounds modest is that we have grown used to giant scale. We forget how much of human freedom depends on smaller circles of trust that interrupt direct exposure to large institutions. Family, congregation, mutual aid network, neighborhood, union, local press, independent school, voluntary association, informal economy. These are not automatically virtuous. They can be oppressive too. But without some mediating layers between person and giant system, the individual becomes unbearably exposed. That exposure is exactly what surveillance modernity prefers. An exposed person is easier to classify. An exposed person is easier to isolate. An exposed person is more likely to treat administrative access as salvation, which brings us to a hard but necessary confession. Many populations submit to surveillance not because they love domination, but because they are already abandoned in other ways. They accept more watching in exchange for thinner promises of security, because material insecurity has left them vulnerable to that bargain. If communities had stronger mutual support, if states were less punitive, if housing were less precarious, if healthcare were less contingent, if border regimes were less violent, if work were less unstable, then perhaps total visibility would be a less persuasive offer. This is why resistance to surveillance and resistance to abandonment belong together. A society that strips people down to dependency will find it easy to sell them monitored dependency as protection. Enoch would not have used those terms, but he would have recognized the pattern. The beings who corrupt the world do not only wield power, they create conditions in which others become desperate beneath that power. And desperation is governance's favorite opening. Who benefits when everything is seen? At this point in the journey, we need to ask the blunt question: who actually benefits from the dream of total visibility? The answer is not everyone equally. The benefits are distributed upward first. Administrators gain more coordinated oversight. Security agencies gain more inputs. Private platforms gain behavioral surplus. Vendors gain contracts. Financial actors gain predictive edges. Employers gain monitoring leverage. Border regimes gain procedural depth. Police gain inference tools. Insurers gain refined sorting. Credit systems gain sharper exclusion. Meanwhile, the ordinary person gains what is most politically useful in any system of unequal exchange, enough convenience to mute revolt. This imbalance is crucial because it reveals the surveillance order as neither accidental nor evenly civic. The infrastructures survive not merely because they function, but because they create strategic advantage for already powerful actors, while externalizing diffuse costs onto populations with less bargaining power. This is one reason public debate about surveillance so often feels strangely bloodless. The harms are dispersed, delayed, and difficult to narrate in one image. The gains are concentrated, contractual, and legible to institutions that can lobby for permanence. A giant system does not need unanimous public love. It needs enough elite utility and enough public habituation. That is the political formula, and it is why so many citizens only dimly register what is happening, even as their world becomes more managed. The credit card still works until it doesn't. The border crossing feels smooth unless the face does not match. The city feels secure unless one's neighborhood absorbs the burden of predictive patrol. The social platform feels free until moderation, ranking, and recommendation quietly shape what becomes visible, sayable, purchasable, or profitable. The welfare portal feels modern until a family loses benefits inside an automated review loop. The digital ID feels efficient until a data discrepancy renders a person unresolvable.
Marvel's power hides behind conditional comfort.
Most people encounter the cage only when the door stops opening. This is why populations with the least margin are often the first to understand system reality. They have less buffer between administrative error and material crisis. The affluent can mistake resilient inconvenience for functionality because a false decline or account review rarely threatens their next meal. The poor cannot afford such illusions. A frozen payment, a delayed approval, a flagged identity, a lost document, a denied claim, a misread face, a missed shift due to platform suspension. These are not abstract inconveniences, they are direct collisions with giant power. This is another secret connection to Enoch. Apocalyptic texts often sharpen vision from below. They do not flatter stable regimes. They reveal what official order looks like to those bearing its violence. They teach the reader to see from the underside of corrupt grandeur. That is exactly the angle required for honest analysis of surveillance and control. If you only ask how a system performs for the well-documented, low-risk, high-status citizen, you will mistake hierarchy for competence. Ask instead how it performs for the undocumented mother, the wrongly flagged traveler, the black teenager in an over-policed neighborhood, the debtor whose digital identity does not resolve cleanly, the refugee whose biometrics become part of permanent transnational archives, the worker under continuous productivity tracking, the dissenter whose speech becomes suspicious because pattern detection tools cannot distinguish conscience from threat. Then the picture changes, then the giant becomes visible, then the price of convenience comes due. This is why surveillance and social inequality are inseparable. A purely civil libertarian critique, while important, is not enough. The issue is not only whether abstract rights are being infringed, the issue is what kinds of populations are being turned into low-recourse subjects for machine-administered power. Once that question becomes central, the moral stakes sharpen. We are no longer debating tools in the abstract. We are debating the acceptable ratio between institutional certainty and human vulnerability, and the modern world keeps trying to push that ratio in the wrong direction. It wants more certainty for systems, more vulnerability for persons, more predictive confidence for authorities, less opacity for the governed, more seamless integration for databases, less contestability for the judged. This is a formula for spiritual suffocation, even when dressed as modernization. The human person against the profile. To resist that suffocation, we need more than policy adjustments. We need a different anthropology. That may sound grandiose, but it is exact. Every surveillance order contains an image of the human person implicit within it. Some see humans as rights-bearing citizens whose opacity requires strong institutional restraint. Some see humans as consumers whose preferences are assets to be harvested. Some see humans as risks to be managed. Some see humans as nodes in logistical systems. Some see humans as populations to be stabilized through incentives. Some see humans as bodies needing constant verification. Some see humans as datasets with legal complications. What image governs our systems now? Increasingly, it is a composite image of the human as profile. A profile is not a person. A profile is a technical condensation of the aspects of a person useful to systems of prediction, ranking, and action. It is a shadow optimized for governance. And once institutions privilege the profile, the living person begins losing ground. Context becomes expensive. Mercy becomes inefficient. Narrative becomes secondary. The cleanest thing to do is trust the score, the flag, the ranking, the output. This is where resistance must become stubbornly human. The answer to a profile is not a more flattering profile. It is a reassertion that no profile can exhaust personhood. That insistence belongs in law, theology, philosophy, education, design, and public culture at once. We need institutions built to assume model fallibility, not model supremacy. We need review structures that restore the right to contest machine conclusions. We need designers trained to think in terms of moral asymmetry, not only technical performance. We need religious and civic leaders willing to say that a body is not simply an identity key and a life is not simply a data trail. We need public languages that describe privacy not as selfish concealment, but as a condition for uncoerced moral growth. Because if we lose that language, we lose the ability to explain why the profile must remain subordinate. The profile can assist. It cannot rule. The profile can inform. It cannot define the soul of a polity. A just order will always need some records, some evidence, some forms of identity, some administration. The question is whether these instruments remain tools under public restraint or become the hidden constitution of everyday life. In too many domains, the latter is already happening. People live inside machine-mediated assessment without fully realizing that assessment has become one of the primary environments in which opportunity itself is distributed. And once opportunity is distributed by hidden assessment, democracy starts decaying below the level of spectacle. Elections may continue. Legislatures may argue. Courts may issue opinions. But the daily metabolism of freedom grows thinner because the path between person and possibility is increasingly crowded with invisible classifiers. That is not healthy constitutional life. That is optimized dependency. The profile also produces a moral temptation in ordinary people. It invites them to become curators of themselves for machine audiences. Build the right digital trail, maintain trust metrics, avoid unusual patterns, protect your score, stay verifiable, stay legible, stay platform safe, stay algorithmically reassuring. Present yourself in ways that clear the thresholds. This is a soft but profound corruption. It teaches people to become managers of their own auditability. The self is reorganized around anticipated machine reception. That is not the same as prudence. It is adaptation to total administration. Enoch would call it a world out of joint, reclaiming time, slowness, and non-optimization. One of the least discussed forms of resistance to surveillance logic is slowness. Modern systems gain power not only from visibility, but from speed. Faster settlement, faster verification, faster screening, faster inference, faster pattern recognition, faster denial, faster automatic response. Speed is treated as proof of superiority, yet speed carries political assumptions. It reduces time for appeal, reflection, contradiction, and human reconsideration. It rewards standardization and punishes complexity. It moves institutions toward preformatted judgment because deliberation looks like inefficiency. But many human goods are slow by nature. Trust is slow. Discernment is slow. Context is slow. Repair is slow. Mercy is slow. Relationship is slow. If a civilization is built around accelerating all these processes into machine-administered flow, it will not only change governance, it will change character. The Enochic imagination warns against accelerated corruption, knowledge arriving in forms that overwhelm proper order. Our response, then, cannot be only technical patching. It must include the deliberate recovery of domains where speed is not the highest value. Schools that privilege depth over monitoring, courts that distrust opaque automation, churches and civic spaces that restore attention rather than fragment it. Local institutions that preserve face-to-face judgment rather than defaulting to remote scoring. Public policies that demand meaningful human review in high-stakes decisions. labor movements that challenge continuous productivity surveillance, families and neighborhoods that keep parts of life unscanned, unposted, and unoptimized. This may sound small against planetary infrastructure, but again, giant systems rely on habits. If the habits change, the legitimacy field changes. A population that relearns the dignity of slowness becomes harder to govern through machine urgency. A population that insists on human explanation becomes harder to sort through black box opacity. A population that values local ties over frictionless dependency becomes harder to isolate. These are not complete solutions. They are preconditions for any complete solution worth having. Without them, reform remains shallow, because the culture still loves the thing that is devouring it, the return of judgment. All of this brings us to one of the strangest elements in Enoch itself, judgment. Apocalyptic literature does not simply describe corruption. It insists that corruption is not the final condition of reality. There is exposure, reckoning, reversal, limits imposed back upon powers that exceeded themselves. For a modern secular audience, that language can feel remote. But even outside confessional belief, its political force remains potent. It says giant systems are not natural, they are historical. What is historical can be challenged, narrowed, regulated, dismantled, or refused. This is essential to remember because surveillance power loves inevitability. It wants to sound like weather, like modernization, like the unavoidable price of complexity. But nothing about our present arrangements was inevitable. Vendors were chosen, laws were passed, exceptions were carved out, procurement regimes favored some actors over others, courts deferred or intervened unevenly, citizens accepted some bargains and resisted others. Technical architectures were designed with certain incentives and not others. The future was built. It can be rebuilt. That is the political translation of apocalyptic judgment, to strip giant systems of their aura of necessity, to insist that concentrated power can be named, bounded, and made answerable, to refuse the lie that because an infrastructure is vast, it must therefore be permanent. But judgment also begins earlier, in discernment. Before one can dismantle a system, one has to stop admiring it uncritically. Before one can regulate a platform, one has to stop speaking as though convenience were the highest civic good. Before one can challenge biometric overreach, one has to stop treating the body as naturally available to whatever institution claims a security rationale. Before one can oppose predictive governance, one has to recover the moral intuition that persons are not reducible to statistical fate. These recoveries sound almost embarrassingly basic. That is because the surveillance order has succeeded partly by making basic truths feel quaint. You are more than your data. Your future should not be pre-written by your profile. A face is not consent. A score is not character. Anomalous does not mean guilty. Visibility does not equal justice. Efficiency does not equal legitimacy. A system can be smart and still be wrong about what a human being is. Every one of those statements is now radical in practice. That fact alone tells us how far the giant has grown. Return to the watchers. Let us go back to the first room. Back before the satellites, before the databases, before the risk models, before the biometric repositories and predictive patrol maps and trust metrics and platform moderation queues and orbital revisit times. Back to the older image from which this entire meditation began. The watchers descend. They teach. The world changes. And the change is not merely technological, it is anthropological. Human beings begin to inhabit knowledge differently. They begin to desire differently. They begin to dominate differently. They begin to organize society under altered conditions of force and perception. That is the hinge. The issue was never the metal by itself. It was the moral world that metal entered, never the spell by itself, the world of manipulation it fed, never the secret by itself, the hierarchy it created between those who hold it and those who live beneath its consequences. That same hinge defines our own era. We are not living through a simple story of gadgets becoming more advanced. We are living through a reorganization of social existence by institutions that can collect, infer, predict, and deny at scales ordinary persons cannot meaningfully oversee. Some of these tools do real good. That complexity must be honored. But honoring complexity does not require surrendering moral judgment. It requires sharpening it, because the decisive question is not whether a tool has utility. Nearly every giant system has utility. The decisive question is what kind of human order the utility quietly builds. Does it deepen democratic accountability, or concentrate unreadable power? Does it protect the vulnerable, or make them ever more measurable and manageable? Does it widen freedom, or simply make obedience smoother? Does it preserve room for appeal, opacity, second chances, and local judgment? Or does it treat all of these as inefficiencies to be optimized away? By those standards, a great deal of our present trajectory should trouble us more than it does. The satellite itself is not the threat. The threat is a civilization increasingly unwilling to tolerate any zone beyond rapid observation. The biometric itself is not the threat. The threat is the conversion of the body into a portable credential whose failure can suspend existence. The predictive model itself is not the threat. The threat is the administrative habit of acting on forecast in ways that harden the very future being forecast. The scoring system itself is not the threat. The threat is a moral order that makes belonging contingent on continuous legibility. The black box itself is not the threat. The threat is that denial by opaque mechanism has become socially tolerable, and once these elements converge, the world begins to look uncannily like a secularized apocalypse. Not in the sense of fire from the sky, but in the sense of revelation. The hidden structure of power becomes visible. We begin to see what our systems assume a person is, what they fear, what they reward, what they can no longer imagine living without. That is what the Book of Enoch offers a modern reader. Not a code book, but an unveiling. It unveils the intoxication of superior knowledge. It unveils the moral disaster of scale without proportion. It unveils the suffering produced when corrupted power descends into ordinary life and calls its own distortions normal. And it unveils something else as well. It unveils how often the world becomes unfree before it becomes obviously tyrannical. That is one of the hardest truths to accept. We like stories where domination announces itself clearly. Black boots, loud decrees, high walls, visible chains. But the digital age has developed subtler grammars, recommendation rather than decree, score rather than stigma, risk management rather than accusation, identity assurance rather than bodily capture, trust and safety rather than speech control, smart governance rather than centralized behavioral engineering, seamless access rather than mandatory dependence. None of these phrases is always false. That is why they are effective. They allow giant systems to enter the public imagination as helpers. By the time they are experienced as rulers, much of the infrastructure is already irreversible. This is why Enoch matters now. It trains suspicion at the right level, not suspicion of every technical craft, not paranoia toward every institution, but suspicion toward the fusion of hidden knowledge, superior scale, weak accountability, and civilizational self-confidence. Whenever those elements combine, freedom is in danger, and that danger becomes most acute when societies are frightened. Fear is the great solvent of resistance. Fear of terrorism, fear of fraud, fear of crime, fear of migration, fear of disorder, fear of pandemics, fear of economic instability, fear of the unverified body, fear of the untracked movement, fear of the unscored person. Under fear, populations become much more willing to accept architectures they would otherwise resist. The Book of Enoch understands fear very well. Its world is full of it. But its response is not to baptize every strategy of control. Its response is to expose the powers teaching corruption and to deny them moral legitimacy. That refusal matters. It reminds us that fear does not automatically sanctify the systems built in response to it. Some responses to fear become larger threats than the uncertainty they were meant to manage. That sentence should haunt modern policy. Some responses to fear become larger threats than the uncertainty they were meant to manage. If a society builds systems that can monitor everyone in order to catch a few, it has changed the meaning of public life. If it builds systems that pre-score populations in order to reduce risk, it has changed the meaning of moral presumption. If it integrates identity, movement, and behavior into continuous assessment, it has changed the meaning of citizenship. If it normalizes opaque denials in the name of scale, it has changed the meaning of justice. And if it treats the poor, the displaced, and the suspect coded as acceptable proving grounds for these methods, it has changed the meaning of human equality. That is why the stakes here are not merely technological, they are constitutional, social, and spiritual at once. Constitutional. because power is being redistributed into infrastructures often difficult to oversee. Social, because categories of trust and suspicion are being automated and scaled. Spiritual, because human beings are being asked to live as profiles before systems that claim to know them enough to govern them. The inner weather of surveillance. There is one more aspect of this story that deserves attention. Surveillance changes not only institutions, it changes emotional climate. A person who knows that movement may be tracked, speech archived, purchases correlated, contacts mapped, and identity repeatedly verified, does not move through the world with the same openness as a person who feels largely unprofiled. Even if the person cannot explain every mechanism, a kind of low-grade anticipatory caution settles in. This is not full terror. It is softer, harder to dramatize, easier to normalize, but normalization does not make it harmless. It can produce chronic self-monitoring. It can reward strategic blandness. It can weaken experimentation. It can make dissent feel expensive. It can intensify social sorting because people learn to avoid the categories that draw system attention. It can also produce learned helplessness. Once people feel that their data trails are everywhere, that major systems are linked, that denials are opaque, that every institution wants more verification, they may begin to believe resistance is futile. This belief is one of giant power's greatest victories. Not total compliance, which is impossible, but resignation. The sense that one's life must simply be lived inside layers of invisible judgment. Resignation is spiritually lethal. It hollows civic imagination. It teaches people to negotiate terms with domination rather than question its legitimacy. It encourages ethical minimalism. Just stay under the threshold, keep your records clean, avoid drawing attention, preserve your access. All of this may be understandable in the short term. Many vulnerable people do not have the luxury of dramatic resistance. But if entire populations live permanently in that register, democratic courage declines. The aim of resistance, then, is not to shame caution. It is to prevent caution from becoming destiny. This requires art as much as analysis. People need images of human life larger than the profile. They need literature, worship, philosophy, neighborhood practice, and political education capable of re-enchanting non-compliant forms of dignity. They need to feel that opacity can be honorable, that mystery is not always threat, that a person is not discredited by being unoptimized, that local loyalties need not dissolve before universal databases, that friction can be the texture of liberty rather than an engineering error. This is one place where ancient texts have contemporary power. They interrupt the flat ontology of technical life. They remind us that human beings have always had to wrestle with powers claiming superior knowledge. They remind us that not all hidden things are benevolent, and not all dazzling systems deserve consent. And they remind us that moral reality does not collapse just because a model has a better interface. Why the margins see first. Another lesson returns here from earlier sections. The margins usually see the system first. Not because the margins are automatically wiser, because the margins feel the pressure sooner. The documented professional may experience biometric identity as convenience. The refugee experiences it as vulnerability archived. The suburban commuter may experience predictive policing as abstract crime prevention. The over-policed neighborhood experiences it as recursive suspicion. The well-banked user may experience digital verification as seamless security. The precarious worker experiences it as one more threshold between self and wages. The frequent flyer may welcome face-based check-ins. The mismatched, misread, or overflagged traveler experiences them as proof that the body can now fail administratively before it is heard humanly. This asymmetry matters because it means the moral truth of a system is rarely most visible from its center of comfort. To understand surveillance honestly, we must listen where the model misfires, where the checkpoint thickens, where the score excludes, where the platform locks, where the profile overdetermines life. That is where the theology of the system reveals itself, not in promotional materials, but in whom it treats as expendably contestable. This is why solidarity is not optional. A population that only resists once its own convenience is threatened will arrive too late. By the time the comfortable encounter the full shape of the giant, the vulnerable have already been living beneath its shadow for years. An Enochian politics would therefore reverse the normal sequence of public reasoning. It would not ask first whether the system improves efficiency for the center. It would ask what the system does to those with the least room to absorb misclassification. It would not ask only whether the database is secure. It would ask what forms of coercion become possible once the database exists. It would not ask only whether the model is more accurate on average. It would ask who pays when it is wrong. It would not ask only whether identity integration reduces fraud. It would ask what forms of social existence become impossible when disconnection from the grid means exclusion from reality. Those questions move us from fascination to ethics, and ethics is where the story must end. Not with amazement that the ancient text feels relevant, not with fear that every machine is fallen, but with judgment about what kind of world we are permitting to be built, what a different future would require. It is easy to end a script like this in two equally unsatisfying ways. One is hysteria, to speak as though every digital system is one seamless satanic prison, and every innovation is proof that doom has fully arrived, that flatters the audience with certainty, but teaches almost nothing.
The other is resignation.
To admit some concerns, recommend modest oversight, and then quietly leave untouched the deeper question of whether a civilization organized around escalating visibility can remain meaningfully free, that flatters prudence but surrenders the argument. A better ending has to be harder than either of those. It has to acknowledge real complexity and still ask for real courage. So what would a different future actually require? First, it would require a political culture willing to distinguish between helpful technology and totalizing infrastructure. This means asking, in every domain, not only does it work, but what dependencies does it create? Who can contest its outputs? Who is most exposed if it fails or is abused? What new powers become thinkable once this data exists? And can a free person live outside this system without practical erasure? These are not anti-technology questions. They are civilization-preserving questions. Second, it would require law and governance designed to preserve human contestability. If a face match, risk score, or predictive inference can materially affect a life, then there must be accessible routes for challenge, real human review, real disclosure standards, real appeal windows, real limits on secondary use, real restrictions on data integration across domains, real prohibitions where harm is predictable and asymmetrically born. A society that does not build these safeguards is not merely innovating recklessly, it is normalizing administrative domination. Third, it would require design ethics far stronger than the ones now fashionable in many technical fields. Not ethics as branding, not ethics as a panel after deployment, ethics at the level of architecture. Engineers, data scientists, procurement officers, city planners, border agencies, financial regulators, educators, and clergy all need languages for recognizing when a system's very premise degrades personhood. Some systems can be improved, some should be narrowed, some should never be built. The inability to say should never be built is one of the clearest signs a civilization has fallen in love with power more than wisdom. Fourth, it would require a cultural recovery of rights that are difficult to monetize. The right to opacity in ordinary lawful life, the right not to be constantly inferred from, the right not to have one's body silently converted into a universal credential, the right not to have one's future pre-scripted by biased datasets, the right to move through some spaces without leaving actionable behavioral residue, the right to gather, worship, dissent, learn, and become without every act being optimized for some institution's appetite. Those rights sound expensive because freedom is expensive. Only domination is cheap at scale. Fifth, it would require solidarity robust enough to defend those already crushed by surveillance's uneven burdens. The refugee whose biometrics become permanent archives, the black and brown communities overexposed to predictive policing and misidentifying recognition systems, the poor subject to punitive eligibility analytics, the precarious worker managed by productivity dashboards, the dissenter flagged by security rhetoric, the marginalized person whose digital thinness becomes grounds for suspicion. If resistance does not begin there, it will eventually become a luxury politics for people who simply want their own devices to feel less creepy. That would be a betrayal of the whole argument, because the moral test of these systems lies exactly where their advocates most hope not to look, in the lives of those easiest to sacrifice administratively. Sixth, it would require re-spiritualizing the question of human dignity without reducing it to sectarian slogans. You do not need to accept the Book of Enoch as scripture to see what it preserves, a suspicion that power can be corrupted precisely through knowledge detached from reverence, a warning that superior vision can become domination, an intuition that giant systems deform ordinary life long before they are challenged, a conviction that the world should not be surrendered to the logic of those who claim the right to see, shape, and rule too much. That is a spiritual resource, whether one is religious or not, because it resists the flattening of the human being into administrable matter. Without such resistance, policy reform alone will be too shallow. Systems will adapt faster than law, because the underlying civilization will still want what the systems offer: anticipation, sorting, frictionless control, engineered reassurance. A people must want freedom more deeply than it wants predictive comfort. That is not a technical problem. It is a moral formation problem. And moral formation takes time. Stories matter here. Rituals matter. Schools matter. Neighborhoods matter. Churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, unions, libraries, local papers, civic clubs, co-ops, legal clinics, and families all matter because they shape what people experience as normal and good. If the only story a society tells is that smarter systems will save us from uncertainty, then giant power will keep growing. But if citizens are taught to recognize the difference between care and control, between service and extraction, between public safety and opportunistic overreach, between knowledge and domination, then the legitimacy field changes. That is how history turns, not only through elections and lawsuits, but through altered moral weather. The last parallel. There is one final parallel between Enoch and the modern surveillance age that deserves to be made explicit. In both worlds, the deepest danger is not simply external oppression. It is the corruption of mediation. The watchers are mediators between realms, but corrupted ones. Modern infrastructures are mediators too. They stand between person and market, person and border, person and law, person and speech, person and mobility, person and welfare, person and employment, person and visibility. Whenever mediation thickens, the quality of the mediator becomes morally decisive. If the mediator is transparent, accountable, proportionate, and limited, then some forms of technical administration may genuinely serve human flourishing. But if the mediator is opaque, unchallengeable, continuously expanding, asymmetrically informed, and aligned more with extraction than with dignity, then it ceases to be service. It becomes a rival sovereignty. That is what giant systems are. Rival sovereignties embedded inside ordinary life. They do not always overthrow the state. Often they colonize it. They do not always abolish freedom. Often they root it through conditions that make refusal ruinous. They do not always silence speech. Often they flood, sort, rank, and shadow ban until speech becomes administratively shaped. They do not always close the border. Often they make crossing dependent on bodily legibility and risk classification. They do not always declare the poor unworthy. Often they simply subject them to endless verification until belonging itself becomes exhausting. This is why so many citizens feel powerless, even in formally open societies. The decisive governors are often not only elected legislators or visible police, but layers of technical mediation so normalized that they are experienced as landscape. Yet landscapes are made, and made things can be unmade, or at least rearranged. To say that is not naive. It is the beginning of political adulthood, final vision, reclaiming human agency. So let us end not with panic, but with vision. What would it mean to reclaim human agency in a world designed for total technological and spiritual control? It would mean building societies in which the person is encountered before the profile is obeyed. It would mean preserving zones of life where opacity is not pathologized. It would mean insisting that no model may quietly substitute for moral judgment in high-stakes decisions. It would mean constraining data fusion before it becomes destiny. It would mean treating the vulnerable not as pilot populations for predictive governance, but as the primary measure of whether any system deserves legitimacy. It would mean refusing to let the convenience of the strong determine the exposure of the weak. It would mean building communities materially capable of surviving partial non-compliance. It would mean raising children who know the difference between being connected and being captured. It would mean teaching citizens that privacy is not secrecy for the guilty, but oxygen for the free. It would mean recovering spiritual and philosophical languages in which a human soul is not reducible to extractable pattern. It would mean believing that uncertainty is not always an enemy, and that a world without any shadow may also be a world without any depth. Most of all, it would mean refusing the oldest lie giant systems tell, that because they are vast, they are final. The Book of Enoch does not leave the world in the hands of the corrupt powers it describes. It reveals them, it judges them, it limits them. Whether one reads that religiously or politically, the lesson remains powerful. Systems of domination thrive on appearing larger than resistance, older than resistance, wiser than resistance, more realistic than resistance. They call themselves inevitable. They call themselves order. They call themselves the only adults in the room. And then, often very slowly, they discover that ordinary human beings can learn to see them clearly. Clarity is dangerous to giant power. So is community. So is memory. So is local competence. So is legal courage. So is theological humility. So is the stubborn insistence that a life is more than a data set waiting to be optimized. That insistence may seem fragile beside satellites, servers, sensors, and state contracts, but fragility is not futility. Many of history's most durable freedoms began as small refusals to describe domination in the language domination preferred. This is one more such moment. We are being asked to call capture convenience, prediction safety, scoring trust, exposure transparency, behavioral shaping good governance. We do not have to agree. And perhaps that is the final gift of reading Enoch in the digital age. It gives us an older courage for naming corrupted brilliance. It teaches us not to confuse dazzling systems with righteous systems. It teaches us that superior knowledge can become fallen knowledge when severed from limits. It teaches us that the truly dangerous thing may not be that our machines are becoming intelligent, but that our institutions are becoming too comfortable treating human beings as intelligible all the way down. That is the road to total control, and the road away from it begins where Enoch always begins, with the refusal to call corruption wisdom simply because it came from above. A final measure. Perhaps there is a simple measure by which every society can test whether its systems are serving persons or consuming them. When an institution encounters a human being, does it leave enough room for that human being to remain more than a category? Enough room to be surprising without becoming suspicious? Enough room to be poor without becoming over-inspected? Enough room to be undocumented without becoming ontologically dubious? Enough room to be politically dissenting without becoming pattern-based threat? Enough room to move without becoming permanently tracked? Enough room to fail without becoming forever scored? Enough room to heal without every wound becoming an input? Enough room to change without historical data functioning as destiny? Enough room to be a body, a neighbor, a worshipper, a learner, a mourner, a parent, a worker, a stranger, a friend, without each of these states instantly becoming raw material for extraction? If the answer is no, then however smart the system, however frictionless the interface, however advanced the analytics, some part of the old corruption is alive inside it. That is the measure, not whether the system dazzles, not whether it scales, not whether it predicts efficiently, not whether officials feel more informed, not whether platforms report higher engagement, not whether investors see value. The measure is whether human beings can still appear before one another as more than administrable signals. The Book of Enoch, read carefully, is full of this concern in symbolic form. It shows us a world where mediating powers have become too large, where knowledge has been severed from humility, where human life is no longer protected by proper boundaries, where corruption spreads by technique, where giant systems consume ordinary creatures, and where the response begins by naming the distortion rather than adapting to it. That is why the book continues to disturb, not because it is obscure, because it is legible. Legible at the point where modern systems would prefer not to be read. It reads what happens when beings above the common human scale decide they are entitled to distribute capacities without accountability. It reads what happens when the hidden becomes weaponized rather than stewarded. It reads what happens when ordinary life begins to bend around powers too large to answer and too integrated to easily escape. And Helen, once you have seen those patterns, It becomes difficult to treat contemporary surveillance merely as a neutral upgrade to social administration. You start hearing the older questions underneath the newer language. What kind of knowledge is this? Who controls it? Who profits from it? Who is made transparent by it? Who remains opaque behind it? What future does it pre-structure? What kind of person must I become to survive inside it? What kind of neighbor will it allow me to recognize? What kind of world calls this progress? Those questions are the beginning of adulthood in a surveillance age. They do not require rejecting every technology. They require refusing every enchantment. No machine deserves reverence because it is impressive. No database deserves trust because it is large. No analytic model deserves deference because it is statistical. No identity architecture deserves obedience because it is efficient. And no civilization deserves to call itself free simply because its citizens can still purchase things while being continuously profiled. There is another test too, perhaps even deeper. Does a society train its people to become inwardly aligned with constant observation, to anticipate judgment before action, to curate themselves for systems rather than cultivate character before God, conscience, neighbor, or truth? If so, then the battle is no longer only around external rights, it is inside formation itself. It is about what sort of interior life remains possible when everything tends toward capture. That is why spiritual sovereignty matters so much. It is not a decorative theme added onto a political issue. It is the name for the refusal to let external systems define the deepest meaning of human worth. A spiritually sovereign person may still be tracked, scored, denied, watched, or coerced. But somewhere the system meets a limit it cannot quite digest, a refusal to become identical with the profile, a refusal to treat the machine's reading as the final truth of the self, a refusal to surrender mystery. Mystery, in this sense, is not superstition. It is the excess of the person over the file, and any politics worthy of the human must preserve it. The last light, so now we can see the full arc, an ancient text about heavenly beings, forbidden arts, giants, corrupted paths, and judgment might seem at first to belong to another mental universe entirely, and in one sense it does. Its cosmology is ancient, its symbols are apocalyptic. Its world is saturated with angels, visions, rebellion, and divine order. But at the level of moral pattern, it remains uncannily close to us, because we too live in a world where superior knowledge is distributed through structures too large for ordinary people to oversee. We too live in a world where technical revelation promises empowerment, while often increasing dependence. We too live in a world where giant systems feed on human life from above. We too live in a world where the vulnerable absorb first what the powerful design. We too live in a world where visibility is increasingly tied to judgment. We too live in a world where the future is being narrowed in advance by institutions that call this wisdom. And we too live in a world where resistance begins by naming these operations honestly. That, perhaps, is the secret connection after all. Not that Enoch predicted facial recognition. Not that the Nephilim were literally satellites. Not that the Watchers were writing software in heaven. Those claims are too small, too literal, and not finally interesting. The real connection is deeper. The Book of Enoch understood that one of the oldest temptations in history is the temptation to use superior knowledge to rise above rightful limits, dominate ordinary life, distort human paths, and call the resulting order necessary. That temptation has not gone away. It has digitized. It has contracted with vendors. It has launched into orbit. It has embedded itself in risk engines and biometric repositories and predictive interfaces. It has learned to speak in policy briefs. It has learned to sound humane. It has learned to call itself smart. And that is why the warning still matters. If power can see too much without being answerable, it will eventually attempt to shape too much. If it can shape too much, it will eventually narrow what it means to be a person. If personhood narrows enough, freedom can survive in name while dying in practice. That is the future hidden inside the gospel of total control. Against that future, Enoch offers no turnkey program. What it offers is something rarer, a moral instinct, a suspicion of corrupted brilliance, a refusal to confuse hidden power with rightful authority, a sympathy for those crushed beneath giant systems, a confidence that exposure is possible, and a reminder that not every light descending from above is holy. Perhaps that is where we should end, not with certainty that we have decoded the whole machine, but with sharper eyes. eyes able to see the difference between governance and domination, between protection and permanent inspection, between service and extraction, between intelligence and wisdom, between a human being and the profile that claims to summarize them. If those eyes open even a little, then the old book has done its work again. It has interrupted enchantment. It has made giant power look strange. It has reminded us that the future does not belong by right to those who can monitor the most. It belongs, if it belongs to anything worth building, to forms of life in which persons remain larger than the systems that would categorize them. And perhaps that is enough to begin, to hear the polished promise of total visibility, to trace the hunger beneath it, to recognize the ancient temptation wearing modern clothes, and to refuse, before it is too late, to mistake surveillance for wisdom simply because it arrived from above. Coda, when the accusation returns. Before we leave, there is one final discipline this entire history asks of us. It asks us to listen differently the next time a government, platform, security apparatus, or expert consortium announces that a new layer of monitoring is necessary for the public good. The next time we are told that deeper identity verification is the price of trust, that integrated scoring is the price of safety, that wider data sharing is the price of inclusion, that predictive triage is the price of fairness, that behavioral analysis is the price of stability, that biometric certainty is the price of humane borders, that total observability is the price of functioning modern life. When those claims arrive, and they will keep arriving, the task is not to reject them automatically or to submit automatically. The task is to ask the Enochian questions with disciplined seriousness. Who is descending with this knowledge? Who authorized them? Who cannot meaningfully refuse? What new dependencies are being built? What capacities of surveillance or exclusion become normal if this infrastructure settles in? Who will likely bear the first wave of errors? What forms of life become harder to sustain outside the system? What human goods are being discounted because they cannot be graphed? And what kind of world will exist if the project succeeds exactly as planned? That last question is especially important. Too much contemporary debate stays at the level of abuse prevention. Can the system be audited? Can bias be reduced? Can transparency be improved? Those are necessary questions, but they are insufficient. Sometimes the deepest problem is not abuse of a system. It is the social ontology the system presupposes when operating correctly. A perfectly efficient surveillance grid is not a moral victory. A highly accurate predictive control regime is not a humane society. A flawlessly interoperable biometric state is not automatically justice. Success can be the catastrophe. The Book of Enoch helps us see that because it is concerned not only with bad outcomes, but with bad orders. Orders in which corruption is built into the way power descends and operates. That is exactly the level modern societies must learn to think on again. Not only does it malfunction, but what sort of civilization does it become when this does not malfunction? If we fail to ask that, then every argument gets trapped inside administrative horizons. The only question becomes whether a system performs well enough to deserve further rule-out. But performance is not the same as legitimacy, and legitimacy is not the same as moral rightness. A prison can be efficient, an extractive market can be innovative, a manipulative platform can be highly engaging, a predictive welfare system can save money. None of that tells us whether the arrangement honors persons. This is the point at which technical intelligence most urgently needs philosophical and spiritual interruption. Not because philosophy or spirituality can replace policy, because policy without them becomes obedient to whatever metrics the giant prefers. The interruption must come from somewhere able to say, no, a human being cannot be exhaustively defined by these inputs. No, a population cannot be justly ruled through permanent anticipatory suspicion. No, convenience for administrators does not justify asymmetrical exposure for the governed. No, the vulnerable may not be treated as experimental surfaces for systems the powerful would never tolerate against themselves. That no is precious. Civilizations lose it slowly. First they call it naive, then unrealistic, then anti-innovation, then extremist. And finally they forget it was ever possible to say at all. That is how enchantment hardens into common sense. Postscript. Refusing the giant's vocabulary. There is still one more step. A great many people now oppose aspects of surveillance and control, while still speaking mostly in the giant's vocabulary. They say we need more trustworthy AI, better scoring, fairer predictive systems, responsible deployment, ethical facial recognition, humane automation, smart privacy, accountable interoperability. Again, some of this language is necessary. Reforms matter, harm reduction matters, better standards matter. But if all criticism remains inside the giant's vocabulary, then the horizon of imagination shrinks. We begin assuming that the only future worth discussing is a better administered version of the same basic model. The Book of Enoch resists this at a profound level. It does not offer management tweaks to the Watcher's corruption. It calls the corruption what it is. It challenges its legitimacy at the level of order that should not tempt us toward absolutism. Modern societies cannot simply abolish every form of digital administration, but it should teach us to speak more freely than the giant permits. We should be able to say that some desires themselves are disordered. The desire to know populations too completely, to profile lives too continuously, to collapse all thresholds into one identity fabric, to erase practical anonymity from ordinary civic life, to convert every uncertainty into a preemptive intervention problem, to treat all opacity as suspicious. These are not merely policy preferences. They are civilizational appetites, and like all appetites, they can become monstrous. Once that is admitted, the argument changes. We are no longer asking only how to make surveillance kinder. We are asking which forms of surveillance a free and dignified society should learn to refuse even when they are efficient. We are asking how much not knowing is healthy in a democracy. We are asking how much room persons need to remain unpredictable without becoming punishable. We are asking whether giant systems of integrated visibility are compatible with any thick conception of moral freedom. Those are larger questions. They are also more honest. And honesty is what the entire Enochian encounter demands. Honesty that our tools are not neutral once embedded in asymmetrical structures. Honesty that the poor and marginalized become targets first. Honesty that prediction changes the thing predicted. Honesty that the body itself is becoming an administrative frontier. Honesty that orbital, biometric, and algorithmic systems together are producing something more than convenience. Honesty that many populations are already living inside digital forms of gatekeeping whose violence remains underdescribed because it so often arrives in polite screens and bureaucratic phrases. If we can hold that honesty without collapsing into hysteria, then perhaps another kind of future remains possible. A future where technology serves without swallowing, where security exists without universal suspicion, where identity can be verified without becoming permanently capturable, where data can assist without destiny, where the margins are defended first, where communities possess enough local strength to negotiate with large systems instead of simply kneeling before them, where the future remains open enough for repentance, surprise, dissent, reinvention, and grace. Those last words matter. Repentance, surprise, dissent, reinvention, grace. None of them fit comfortably inside total predictive administration. That discomfort tells us something vital. The most humane world may not be the one that predicts us best. It may be the one that leaves us enough room to become more than what prediction can see. And that, at bottom, may be the deepest secret connection between Enoch and the modern age. The ancient text warns that when power seeks too much through forbidden knowledge, the world itself grows crooked. Our task is not to romanticize the past. It is to recognize the crookedness in the present before we learn to call it home. An ending against inevitability. There is a final temptation in every age of expanding control. It is not merely the temptation to dominate. It is the temptation to believe domination has already won. Once that belief settles into a population, resistance becomes mostly symbolic. People speak in critical tones, while quietly reorganizing their lives around what they assume cannot be changed. They stop asking whether a system is legitimate and ask only how to navigate it more successfully. They train their children to become legible, employable, unflagged, safely predicted. They build ethics around not triggering the machine rather than around pursuing the good. They do not surrender dramatically. They adapt. This is one of the reasons giant systems endure. They do not need unanimous faith. They need habituated pessimism. That is why any serious recovery of human agency must also be a recovery of historical imagination. Surveillance empires present themselves as culmination, as the mature endpoint of rational administration, as the unavoidable result of complexity, danger, and scale. But history rarely ends where its managers say it has ended. Systems that once looked immovable crack when enough people stop performing inevitability on their behalf. Cracks begin in strange places. A court ruling here, a whistleblower archive there. A community refusing one more layer of unnecessary extraction. A teacher showing students how ranking systems shape selfhood. A religious leader naming data greed as a spiritual vice. A city rejecting an overreaching procurement contract. A migrant collective documenting harms the official story ignored. A labor action against workplace surveillance. A neighborhood learning again how to meet needs without turning every relation into a platform dependency. None of these acts alone defeats giant power. That is not the point. Fart is not the point. Fan is not pompen. The point is that history moves when inevitability loses its atmosphere. And atmospheres are moral creations. The Book of Enoch, read with sobriety, is fundamentally anti-inevitability. It does not describe a world in which corruption simply becomes the final shape of things. It is a protest text against the presumption that powers above may arrange earthly life as they please forever. It insists that giant corruption can be unveiled, that false mediators can be judged, and that what looks permanent from below may still be contingent from a higher moral vantage. Even in secular translation, that insight remains explosive. It means that the surveillance order should be understood not as destiny, but as choice accumulated over time, and what has been accumulated can be interrupted, not easily, not cleanly, not without sacrifice, but interrupted nonetheless. If you want to know whether a people is still free enough to resist, do not ask first whether they have perfect privacy laws or ideal institutions. Ask whether they can still imagine a world in which not everything is tracked. Ask whether they can still feel revulsion when the body becomes a universal credential. Ask whether they can still be shocked by opaque denial. Ask whether they can still recognize that the poor should not pay for elite convenience. Ask whether they can still say that some systems are wrong not because they malfunction, but because they misunderstand what a human being is. If those instincts survive, then freedom has not fully died. If they vanish, then even democratic language may become only ornament over administrative capture. This brings us, finally, to the outline's closing hope. Reclaiming human agency in a world designed for total technological and spiritual control. The phrase can sound impossibly large, but agency is reclaimed in layers. It is reclaimed when people learn to detect manipulation in the rhetoric of convenience. It is reclaimed when communities rebuild material resilience so that refusal becomes possible. It is reclaimed when institutions are forced to answer for black box harms. It is reclaimed when the vulnerable are defended as the measure of justice rather than treated as experimental terrain. It is reclaimed when children are taught that privacy is part of dignity. It is reclaimed when religious and philosophical traditions stop treating technological systems as morally self-justifying. It is reclaimed when lawmakers understand that interoperability can be a threat to liberty, not merely a sign of modernization. It is reclaimed when engineers recover the courage to say no. It is reclaimed when ordinary people stop flattering giant systems with language those systems have not earned, and perhaps, most of all, it is reclaimed when a civilization remembers that uncertainty is not only a problem to be solved. It is also the open space in which freedom, repentance, mercy, improvisation, and love remain possible. A world with no uncertainty may sound efficient. It would also be a world with no moral horizon wider than management. That is not a human future. It is a cage built from foresight, which means the real conflict here is not between old religion and new technology, or between primitive fear and modern rationality. The real conflict is between two visions of order. One vision says that order is secured when enough can be known, scored, anticipated, and shaped from above. The other says that order worthy of the human must leave room for opacity, conscience, local life, vulnerability, forgiveness, dissent, and the irreducible excess of persons over systems. The first vision builds giant infrastructures. The second builds free societies. The first wants submission disguised as seamlessness. The second accepts friction as the cost of dignity. The first calls human unpredictability a threat. The second understands that unpredictability is part of moral life. The first trusts superior sight. The second distrusts any sight that cannot be held accountable. That is the choice beneath all the technical detail. And Enoch, from his ancient distance, still leans into the present and asks the question we would rather postpone. What kind of knowledge are we becoming obedient to? If the answer is knowledge that enlarges domination, narrows personhood, and teaches us to treat human beings as profiles awaiting judgment, then the warning has already arrived. Not from heaven in spectacle, but inside the systems we are busy normalizing. The task now is not to decode a hidden prophecy line by line. It is to decide whether we will continue building a civilization that mistakes control for wisdom, or whether we will recover the older, harder wisdom that says limits are holy, persons exceed profiles, and no tower of seeing, however brilliant, however planetary, however data-rich, has the right to become the final author of what a human life may be. If we recover that wisdom, even imperfectly, then the future opens again. If we do not, the giants will not need to conquer us dramatically. We will have trained ourselves to live beneath them, and that may be the most modern Enochian warning of all. One more question. Maybe there is one more question worth leaving in the air after everything else has been said. What does a society reveal about itself by the kinds of uncertainty it is willing to tolerate? A humane society will tolerate some uncertainty in order to preserve freedom. It will tolerate some opacity in order to preserve dignity. It will tolerate some friction in order to preserve contestability. It will tolerate some administrative inconvenience in order to preserve the principle that no life should be silently overruled by unreadable systems. It will tolerate some unpredictability because it knows that persons are not equations to be solved once and for all. An insecure society makes the opposite bargain. It becomes willing to sacrifice freedom for anticipatory control, dignity for visibility, and contestability for seamlessness. It says, in effect, that the human future is too risky to leave open. Better to classify more, verify more, monitor more, score more, infer more, and intervene earlier. Better to seal every gap through which uncertainty enters. Better to make life machine readable enough that surprise itself grows costly. But surprise is not always the enemy. Sometimes surprise is conscience. Sometimes surprise is repentance. Sometimes surprise is political awakening. Sometimes surprise is the poor speaking when the system expected silence. Sometimes surprise is solidarity where prediction expected fragmentation. Sometimes surprise is mercy interrupting calculation. Sometimes surprise is precisely the sign that a society has not yet been reduced to technical management. That is one reason the biblical and apocalyptic imagination, including Enoch's, remains so potent. It lives in a universe where history can still be interrupted, where powers that look overwhelming are not ultimate, where the structures above do not get to define the whole meaning of the creatures below, where reality is larger than the systems trying to map it. We need that reminder now, because one of the most seductive lies of our century is that anything not captured does not really count. If a pain is not in the system, it is less legible. If a relation is not datafied, it is less valuable. If a community cannot be modeled, it is less governable. If a person cannot be scored, it is less trustworthy. If a future cannot be predicted, it is less safe. But a world governed entirely by those assumptions will not simply be highly managed. It will be spiritually starved. It will know more and understand less, track more and trust less, classify more and recognize less, predict more and forgive less. That is not wisdom. It is hypertrophied control. And every civilization that mistakes control for wisdom eventually turns its own people into objects of anxious administration. That is why the final act of resistance may be simpler and harder than grand rhetoric suggests. To insist in practice that persons come before profiles, that communities come before dashboards, that justice comes before efficiency, that dignity comes before extractive convenience, that no tower of knowledge absolves power from humility, that the poor may not be made legible in ways the powerful would never accept for themselves, that some doors should remain closed to giant systems, even if those systems promise order in return, that every act of technological governance must answer not only to capability, but to a moral account of the human being it presumes. Those insistences do not solve everything, but without them, nothing worth calling freedom survives for long. And so the last image is not of the machine itself, not the satellite, not the camera, not the biometric scanner, not the dashboard, not the risk model. The last image is older. A world standing beneath powers that know too much, reach too far, and call their reach necessary. A world asked to admire what is in fact distorting it. A world in need of witnesses who can still say, "This is not wisdom, this is corruption made efficient." The Book of Enoch gives us language for those witnesses. What we do with that language now is the real question. A final reflection. If there is any hope in this long argument, it lies here. The systems we have described are immense, but they are not sacred. They are built, they are funded, they are justified, they are normalized. And because they are normalized, they can also be denormalized. That work begins whenever a citizen, a scholar, a pastor, a coder, a lawyer, a teacher, a migrant advocate, a journalist, or a neighbor refuses to accept the giant's definition of realism. Whenever someone says that a person should not have to become endlessly legible to deserve movement, care, work, bread, or belonging. Whenever someone insists that the answer to social fragility cannot always be deeper extraction. Whenever someone points out that a system's brilliance does not excuse its anthropology. Whenever someone asks not only what a technology does, but what kind of soul a society must have to desire it so intensely. Those questions reopen the future. And reopening the future may be the most important act of all. Because systems of total control do not only monitor bodies, they colonize expectation. They try to persuade us that no other order is practical, that no other way of balancing security and freedom is adult, that no other imagination of community can survive at scale. The Book of Enoch stands against exactly that kind of resignation. It remembers a world in which powers became arrogant, crossed their limits, and disfigured earthly life. But it also remembers that arrogance is not eternity, that memory matters. It matters when databases look permanent. It matters when machine judgment feels unavoidable. It matters when the poor are told to accept more scrutiny as the price of assistance. It matters when border technologies grow more intimate. It matters when convenience becomes the moral blackmail of the century. And it matters when whole populations begin to forget that freedom sometimes requires the right not to be seen too clearly by the wrong power. So let the final note be sober, but not defeated. We are not helpless before the grid, but neither are we safe from it by rhetoric alone. The struggle ahead will require institutions, law, technical courage, community memory, spiritual seriousness, and a public willing to choose dignity over some portion of convenience. That is a costly choice. It always has been. Yet every freedom worth keeping has required exactly that kind of cost. And perhaps that is the truest modern echo of Enoch's warning. When forbidden knowledge becomes an operating system for society, the first task is not panic, it is discernment. The second is refusal. And the third is rebuilding forms of life the giant cannot easily digest.